Power doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It walks into a room and watches grown men remember every sin they've ever committed. Duke Cadric Raventhorn understood this truth the way other men understood breathing. Tonight, standing in the grand hall of Blackthorn Keep, while 12 noble lords sat frozen in their gilded chairs, he embodied that truth so completely that the candle flames seemed to bend away from him. They had come to demand his compliance. They would leave remembering why their fathers taught them to fear the Raventhorn name. What happens when absolute power meets the one thing it cannot control? Stay with me. This story doesn't end where you think it does. The winter wind howled against the fortress walls like something dying. Inside the great hall, silence pressed down with the weight of iron. Cadric stood at the head of the obsidian table, his hands clasped behind his back, watching the nervous sweat gather on Lord Pemberton's upper lip. The old fool kept glancing toward the door as if escape were possible. It wasn't. The guards outside answered to Cadric alone, and everyone in this room knew it. 12 lords, 12 men who thought their bloodlines meant something. Cadric had allowed them into his fortress because power without demonstration became rumor, and rumors bred stupidity. Tonight would serve as education. Lord Pemberton finally found his voice. It came out smaller than he intended. Your Grace, the Council believes it has the authority to summon me like a servant. Cadric's voice cut through the hall, quiet and surgical. That's the first mistake. Means bought. Pemberton's face reddened. Beside him, Lord Hastings shifted in his chair, the wood creaking beneath his bulk. We're simply requesting your consideration, Your Grace. The alliance with House Mordain would secure your shipping routes through the northern ports. Cadric moved along the table's edge, his boots echoing against stone. Would protect your merchant vessels from the pirates you're too incompetent to eliminate yourselves. Would allow you to profit from my military strength while contributing nothing but your fat daughters and empty promises. Wolves. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Lord Blackwood, younger than the others and stupider for it, stood abruptly. You overstep, Raventhorn. This council represents... Cadric looked at him. Just looked. The young lord's words died in his throat. He sat down slowly, his hand trembling as it gripped the armrest. This council represents fear dressed in silk. Cadric stopped at the far end of the table, his shadow falling across the assembled nobility like judgment. Your fathers understood the natural order. They bent their knees and prospered. You mistake my tolerance for weakness and come here making demands as if you have leverage. We have the support of half the kingdom, Lord Vexler said quietly. He was the dangerous one, the only man in the room with a functioning brain. Your military might is considerable, Your Grace, but civil war would cost you everything. Civil war. Cadric let the words hang in the air. You think 12 frightened merchants with private guards constitute a military threat. You think threatening me in my own fortress demonstrates strength rather than suicidal stupidity. He walked back to his position at the table's head, his movements deliberate and unhurried. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. I could have you all executed before morning. Your families would receive your bodies in pieces. Your estates would be absorbed by the crown. Your names would be struck from the histories. And within a generation, no one would remember you existed. He paused, letting them absorb the truth. But I won't. Do you know why? No one answered. Lord Pemberton's hand shook as he reached for his wine. Because dead martyrs create problems. Living cowards create examples. Cadric placed both hands flat on the table, leaning forward. You will return to your estates. You will tell your fellow conspirators that Duke Raventhorn declines your generous offer to dictate his personal choices. You will explain, in whatever words preserve your dignity, that challenging me was a miscalculation born of desperation rather than strategy. And if we refuse, Lord Blackwood's voice cracked on the last word. Cadric smiled. It was the most terrifying thing any of them had seen. Then I'll teach you what refusal costs. I'll start with your oldest son, not killed, just removed from succession, publicly humiliated, exiled to the frozen territories where men go to be forgotten. Then your second son, then your daughters, married off to the lowest houses I can find, Breeding stock for families so minor they don't rate formal titles. Your wife will watch her children's futures burn. And you will live long enough to understand that defying me doesn't end in death. It ends in watching everything you love turn to ash while you remain powerless to stop it. The silence that followed was absolute. Outside, the wind screamed against the walls. Inside, 12 men confronted the reality that they had walked into the monster's lair armed with nothing but arrogance. Lord Vexler stood first. He bowed, precise and formal. "The council will consider your position, Your Grace. The council will obey," Cedric corrected. "Dismissed." They filed out in silence, their dignity shredded. Only Lord Vexler paused at the threshold, glancing back with something almost like respect, or perhaps fear so refined it resembled admiration. Then he too was gone, and Cedric was alone with the candles and the cold. He poured himself wine, the dark red liquid catching the firelight. His hand was steady. It always was. Men saw his calm and mistook it for lack of feeling. They were wrong. Cedric felt everything. He simply refused to let emotions dictate action. That was the difference between rulers and victims. Victims felt and reacted. Rulers felt and calculated. The door opened behind him. He didn't turn. Only 3 people could enter this room unannounced, and 2 of them were dead. That was a performance worthy of your father. Marcus Vallon crossed to the fireplace, warming his hands. Though he would have executed at least 2 of them for emphasis. My father ruled through fear alone. It made him powerful and paranoid. Cedric remained at the table, studying his wine. Fear keeps men obedient. It doesn't keep them loyal. And you want loyalty. Marcus turned to face him. They had known each other since childhood, when Marcus was the blacksmith's son, and Cedric was the heir learning to swing a sword twice his size. Decades later, Marcus served as his captain of the guard, and the only person in Valemont who could speak to him without calculation. I want efficiency. Cedric took a drink. Loyalty is a byproduct of effective governance. Fear is a tool. So is reward. So is respect. You use what's appropriate for the situation. And tonight's situation required reminding them you're capable of cruelty that makes the old Duke look merciful. Tonight's situation required reminding them that challenging me has consequences their limited imaginations haven't conceived. Cedric set down his glass. They'll return to their estates. They'll whisper about my instability. They'll convince themselves that I'm losing control, that my refusal to bend proves weakness rather than strength. And then they'll make their next mistake. Marcus studied him carefully. You're expecting them to escalate. I'm counting on it. Cedric moved to the window, looking out at the snow-covered kingdom spread below the fortress. Lights flickered in the distant city, small and fragile against the winter dark. They came here united. They'll leave fractured. Pemberton will want to retreat. Blackwood will want revenge. Vexler will calculate odds and likely withdraw. The others will panic and make noise. Within a week, they'll be fighting amongst themselves about strategy. And while they're fighting, I'll identify which ones are genuinely dangerous versus merely loud. Cedric's reflection stared back at him from the glass, his face carved from shadows. Then I'll remove the dangerous ones in ways that make the loud ones grateful to survive. Your father's son, after all. My father died choking on his own rage because he never learned the difference between breaking men and bending them. Cedric turned from the window. I won't make his mistakes. Marcus nodded slowly. There's talk in the city about the Winter Sovereign Ball, about you, and don't. The single word carried enough weight to stop him mid-sentence. That's not relevant to tonight's discussion. It's relevant to every discussion now. The nobles aren't just angry about your refusal to marry their daughters. They're terrified because for the first time in your life, you made a decision that wasn't calculated. You saw her and nothing. Cedric's voice remained level, but something shifted behind his eyes. She's a distraction, an interesting variable. Nothing more. You're lying to yourself. I'm controlling the situation. There's a difference. Marcus crossed his arms, his expression skeptical. You've attended 6 court functions in the past month. Before that, you hadn't shown your face at a ball in 3 years. The entire kingdom has noticed. More importantly, she's noticed. Kedrick returned to the table, refilling his glass with precise movements. Lady Seraphina Vale is an educated woman from a fallen house. She presents as defiant because she has nothing left to lose. That makes her dangerous in small ways and irrelevant in large ones. She looks at you like you're just a man. Then she's more naive than I estimated. Or more perceptive. Marcus moved closer, lowering his voice. Everyone else sees the Duke, the title, the power, the fortress and the armies and the reputation built on your father's brutality. She sees you, Kedrick. That terrifies you more than any noble conspiracy. You're projecting philosophy onto basic social interaction. But Kedrick's grip on his glass tightened almost imperceptibly. She's pretty, she's articulate, she refuses to grovel. These qualities make her notable in a court full of sycophants. They don't make her significant. Then why did you reject the imperial regent's daughter? Because accepting would have created political obligations I'm not willing to assume. You told Lord Pemberton tonight that you make your own decisions, that no council dictates your personal choices. Marcus leaned against the table. That wasn't about governance. That was about her. Kedrick drained his wine and set the glass down with finality. This conversation is over. One more thing. Marcus straightened. There's been increased activity near the western borders. Scouts reported movement that suggests House Mordan is positioning troops despite your rejection of their alliance proposal. Let them position. They won't move without provocation, and I won't provide it. Kedrick moved toward the door, dismissing the topic. Double the patrols, document everything. If they cross into Valamont territory, I want evidence detailed enough to justify complete retaliation. And if they attack first, then I'll demonstrate why my father's reputation was earned and mine is deserved. Dentex arms best. Marcus nodded and departed, leaving Kedrick alone again. The fire crackled in the hearth. Wind howled against stone. Somewhere in the fortress below, guards changed shifts and servants prepared for morning, and life continued in the mechanical way it did inside castles built for war. Kedrick stood in the center of the great hall, surrounded by empty chairs and the ghost of his father's presence. The old duke had ruled from this room for 40 years, building power through systematic brutality that made rebellion impossible and loyalty irrelevant. He had created an empire of fear so complete that men obeyed from instinct rather than choice. And he had died alone, poisoned by someone close enough to reach his food, murdered by the very fear he had cultivated. Kedrick had been 19. He had found his father's body slumped over this table, eyes wide with betrayal, mouth still stained with the wine that killed him. The investigation had been thorough. The culprit was never found, likely because the culprit was one of a dozen people with motive and opportunity, any of whom might have acted, all of whom benefited from his death. That was the legacy of ruling through fear alone. Not strength, not security, just a corpse and a succession crisis, and the knowledge that absolute power without wisdom was just slow suicide. Kedrick had vowed to be different, smarter, more calculated. He would build an empire that respected him because it feared the consequences of defiance and benefited from the rewards of obedience. He would create a system so efficient that challenging him would be strategically impossible rather than merely dangerous. He would be the ruler his father never managed to become, one who died of old age rather than betrayal. And then he had walked into the Winter Sovereign Ball 3 weeks ago and seen Seraphina Vale standing alone near the windows, silver silk catching candlelight, her posture speaking volumes about dignity maintained in the face of collective dismissal. She hadn't noticed him immediately. When she did, she didn't curtsy, didn't lower her eyes, just looked at him with an expression that suggested she was evaluating him rather than being evaluated. No one looked at him that way. No one dared. He had approached her because protocol demanded it. He was the Duke. She was a guest. Conversation was expected. But the moment he spoke to her, everything he had carefully constructed began to crack. Your Grace. She had said it without deference. Just a title. Just words. I was wondering if you actually attend these functions, or if they wheel out a statue and hope no one notices the difference. The court had collectively held its breath. Beside him, Marcus had tensed. Across the room, Lady Pemberton had gone pale. And Kedrick had done something he hadn't done in years. He had laughed. Not the calculated humor he deployed for political effect. Actual laughter, brief and surprised and genuine. She had smiled then, small and knowing, and he had realized with absolute clarity that this woman was going to destroy every carefully maintained defense he had built. Now, standing in the empty hall, he could admit what he had refused to tell Marcus. She was dangerous, not because she threatened his power, because she made him question whether power was enough. The thought was poison. Power was everything. Power was survival. Power was the only truth that mattered in a world built on violence and betrayal. Without power, you were a victim. With power, you controlled your fate. This was the lesson his father had beaten into him alongside sword training and strategic thinking. This was the truth that had kept him alive through assassination attempts and noble conspiracies, and the endless parade of people who wanted him dead. But when Serafina looked at him, none of that seemed to matter. She saw past the title and the reputation and the carefully constructed persona. She saw him, just him, and that was more terrifying than any army. Kedrick forced himself to focus. Tomorrow he would receive reports about the nobles' movements. Within days, the conspiracy would either collapse or escalate. Either outcome was manageable. He had plans within plans, contingencies for every possible scenario. Control was a matter of preparation meeting opportunity. He extinguished the candles one by one, watching darkness reclaim the hall. Then he walked through the fortress toward his private chambers, his footsteps echoing against stone worn smooth by generations of Raventhorns who had walked these same paths. The castle was a labyrinth of defensive architecture and hidden passages. He knew every corridor, every weakness, every place where an enemy might hide. His father had taught him that paranoia wasn't mental illness. It was survival instinct refined through experience. The guards at his door saluted sharply. Inside his chambers were austere. A massive bed that had belonged to his grandfather. A desk covered in reports and correspondence. Weapons mounted on walls. No art, no decoration, no sentiment, just function and utility and the knowledge that everything he owned could be replaced except his life. He stood at the window looking out at Valemont spread beneath the fortress like a kingdom of shadows and snow. This was his. All of it. Every house and farm and village. Every life lived within these borders existed because he maintained order. That was the covenant between ruler and ruled, obedience in exchange for security. It was a transaction, clean, efficient, uncomplicated by emotion or morality. Except morality was starting to whisper in the back of his mind in Serafina's voice. She had asked him once, during a brief conversation at another tedious function, whether he believed fear and respect were the same thing. He had told her they were different words for identical outcomes. She had smiled sadly and said, "Then you've never experienced either one genuinely." The words had haunted him for days. Still did. Because beneath the armor of certainty and control, he knew she was right. His people obeyed him because defiance meant consequences. His nobles cooperated because resistance meant ruin. His guards served because loyalty was rewarded and betrayal was punished. But none of it was respect. None of it was genuine. It was just fear wearing different masks. And he was so tired of masks. The thought came unbidden and unwelcome. Kedrick pushed it away violently. Tiredness was weakness. Questioning was doubt. Doubt was the first step toward the mistakes that killed rulers. His father had taught him that lesson before Kedrick could read. The moment you question whether you deserve power is the moment someone takes it from you. A knock at the door, sharp and urgent. Kedrick turned from the window. "Enter." One of the younger guards stepped inside, his face pale. "Your Grace, there's been an incident in the lower city. The house that belonged to—" He faltered. "Speak clearly." "Lady Serafina Vale's residence, Your Grace. It's on fire." Everything stopped, the world reduced to those words and their implications. Kedrick's mind raced through possibilities. Accident, arson, message, attack. Each one carried different consequences. Each one demanded different responses. Casualties? His voice remained level despite the way his heart rate accelerated. "Unknown, Your Grace. The city guard is responding now. Captain Valen is already en route." Kedrick was moving before the guard finished speaking. He grabbed his coat from the chair, strapping on his sword out of habit rather than necessity. "Prepare my horse. Now!" "Your Grace, it's not safe for you to—" "Did I ask for your tactical assessment?" Kedrick's voice cut like a blade. "Prepare my horse or find new employment." The guard fled. Kedrick followed seconds later, his stride eating up the corridor distance. His mind worked through scenarios with cold precision. If this was the noble's doing, it was escalation beyond anything he had anticipated. If this was random tragedy, the timing was catastrophically coincidental. If this was a trap designed to lure him out of the fortress, it was working. He didn't care. The calculation that usually governed his decisions had vanished, replaced by something far more dangerous: urgency without analysis. He knew it was irrational, knew he was making the exact mistake he had spent his life avoiding, knew that riding into potential danger for one woman violated every principle of strategic thinking. He didn't care. The stable master had his horse ready by the time Kedrick reached the courtyard. He mounted in one fluid motion, spurring the animal toward the main gate without waiting for his guard detail. Behind him, he heard Marcus shouting orders, heard horses being saddled, heard the organized chaos of men trying to protect a duke who had suddenly stopped protecting himself. The ride down from Blackthorn Keep was treacherous in winter darkness. The path descended in sharp switchbacks, ice hidden beneath fresh snow. The cliff edge always one mistake away. Kedrick pushed his horse harder than wisdom allowed. The animal responded, bred for war and trained for absolute obedience, its hooves finding purchase on terrain that would have killed lesser mounts. The city rose around him as he descended, buildings packed tight in the old district where minor nobility clung to former glory through architectural stubbornness. Smoke rose ahead, visible against the night sky, orange flames painting the snow-covered streets with hellish light. Citizens gathered at safe distances, watching the house burn with the morbid fascination people reserved for disasters that didn't directly threaten them. Kedrick dismounted before his horse fully stopped, throwing the reins to a city guardsman too shocked to do anything but catch them. The house was fully engulfed, flames eating through the structure with terrifying speed. The heat hit him in waves. Around the perimeter, guards formed a line, keeping the crowd back while others worked with buckets in a futile attempt to control the blaze. "Where is she?" Kedrick grabbed the nearest officer, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Your Grace!" The man's eyes went wide with shock and fear. "We don't know. We haven't been able to enter the structure. The fire's too intense." If anyone was inside, Kedrick released him and moved toward the house. Someone tried to stop him. He knocked the hand away without breaking stride. The heat was overwhelming now, the flames roaring with the sound of destruction. Every rational part of his mind screamed that entering was suicide. Every part that made him human didn't care. Marcus appeared beside him, gripping his arm with enough force to leave bruises. "You can't go in there. Get off me! If you die rushing into a burning building for a woman you barely know, everything you've built collapses. The nobles will tear Valamon apart. Everything your father bled for, everything you fought to maintain, it all ends because you couldn't control yourself for 5 minutes." "I said get off me!" Kedrick's voice dropped to something dangerous. "She's not in there." A new voice, clear and steady, cutting through the noise and heat and chaos. They both turned. Seraphina stood 20 feet away, wrapped in a heavy cloak, her face smudged with ash but very much alive. Relief hit Kedrick with physical force. He took a step toward her before catching himself, reasserting control through sheer will. "Where were you?" The question came out harsher than intended. "At the cathedral. Charity work. Boring but necessary." She moved closer, her eyes tracking the flames consuming what was left of her home. Someone wanted to send a message. "They got my staff out first, so this wasn't about killing, just intimidation." "Who?" Kedrick's hand moved to his sword without thought. "Does it matter? You embarrassed the noble council tonight. They needed to respond in a way that demonstrated power without directly challenging you." Her voice carried strange calm. "Burning the home of a woman you've shown interest in accomplishes that. It's indirect, it's cruel. It's exactly what frightened men do when they can't confront the real threat." Marcus watched the exchange with calculating eyes. Around them, the city guard continued their futile efforts to contain the blaze. The house groaned as structural supports failed, collapsing inward with a shower of sparks that rose toward the winter sky like dying stars. "You'll stay at Blackthorn Keep." Kedrick made it a statement rather than an offer. Kedrick made it a, "I'll stay at the Temple District. They have rooms for displaced nobility." Seraphina met his eyes without flinching. "I don't need your protection. I need you to understand that every time you demonstrate weakness for me, someone else suffers the consequences. This isn't weakness. Then what is it? She stepped closer, her voice dropping so only he could hear. You rode down here without your guard, without thinking, without the calculation that supposedly governs every decision you make. If this had been a trap, you'd be dead. And for what? To rescue someone who wasn't in danger? Well, the truth of her words hit harder than any blade. She was right. He had abandoned strategy, abandoned caution, abandoned every principle that kept him alive. And she wasn't even grateful. She was angry. I won't apologize for... I'm not asking for an apology. I'm asking you to be smarter. Serafina's eyes held something he couldn't name. Your enemies are watching. Every crack in your armor is an opportunity. Tonight you showed them the biggest crack imaginable, that I can make you irrational. Behind them, Marcus cleared his throat. Your Grace, we should return to the fortress. Kedrick ignored him. Come with me. No. That wasn't a request. I don't care. Serafina's defiance burned brighter than the flames consuming her house. You want to protect me? Then be the Duke everyone fears. Make the people who did this regret they were ever born. But don't turn me into another piece on your chessboard. Don't make me a symbol of your power or your weakness or whatever this is between us. What is this between us? The question hung in the air between them, raw and unplanned. Around them, the city guard worked and the crowd watched and the house burned. But in that moment, none of it mattered except the space between a duke who controlled kingdoms and a woman who refused to be controlled. Serafina's expression softened almost imperceptibly. That's the question that's going to destroy everything, isn't it? She turned and walked away before he could respond. The crowd parted for her automatically, drawn by the dignity in her carriage despite the ash on her face and the ruin of her home behind her. Kedrick watched her disappear into the winter night, feeling something crack inside his chest that had nothing to do with strategy or power or control. Marcus moved beside him, his voice quiet. Well, this just became significantly more complicated. Kedrick turned back to the burning house, watching flames consume the last remnants of the structure. His mind was already working through implications and responses. Someone had targeted Serafina to send him a message. That meant war. Not the political maneuvering he had expected, but actual, open warfare between him and whoever was stupid enough to make this personal. Find out who did this. His voice carried absolute certainty. I want names. I want evidence. I want everything documented so thoroughly that when I destroy them, no one can claim it was unjust. And if it leads back to the council, then the council learns what happens when political strategy crosses into personal attack. Kedrick mounted his horse, looking down at Marcus with eyes that reflected the dying flames. They wanted to see weakness. Instead, they're going to learn the difference between my father's cruelty and mine. He killed people because he enjoyed it. I'll kill them because they made it necessary. The ride back to Blackthorn Keep was slower. Marcus rode beside him, their horses climbing the switchback path toward the fortress silhouetted against the stars. Behind them, the city settled back into winter darkness, the fire reduced to smoke and memory. Kedrick's mind churned through calculations and contingencies. The attack on Serafina's house had been designed to accomplish multiple goals: demonstrate the noble's power, create fear among those who might side with him, and most importantly, prove that caring about someone made you vulnerable. Standard intimidation tactics. Effective if the target was anyone else. But Kedrick Raventhorn had learned a long time ago that vulnerability was only fatal if you let it control you. Yes, he cared about Serafina. Yes, that caring had made him irrational tonight. But irrationality could be weaponized just like any other tool. Let his enemies think he was weakened by attachment. Let them believe they had found his pressure point. They would lean on it. They would exploit it. And when they did, he would be ready. They reached the fortress as midnight bells rang across the kingdom. Guards opened the gates immediately, recognizing the Duke despite the absence of formal procession. Inside the courtyard, servants waited with torches and worried expressions. News traveled fast in Blackthorn Keep. Everyone knew the Duke had ridden into potential danger for a woman. Everyone understood what that meant. Kedrick dismounted, handing his reins to the stablemaster. Marcus? My study. 5 minutes. Awesome. He didn't wait for acknowledgement. The fortress knew his moods well enough to clear a path when he walked with this particular intensity. He climbed the stairs 3 at a time, his mind organizing the next phase of his response. By the time Marcus entered the study, Kaedric had spread maps across the desk and was marking locations with red ink. These are the estates of every noble who attended tonight's meeting. He didn't look up from his work. I want intelligence on each one. Guard rotations, trade routes, political alliances, financial vulnerabilities, mistresses, gambling debts, every piece of leverage that might exist. Marcus studied the map. You're planning comprehensive retaliation. I'm planning surgical elimination of everyone who thought tonight's attack was clever strategy. Kaedric marked another location. Whoever ordered that fire assumed I would respond with emotion. They were right, but they assumed my emotion would make me stupid. That was their mistake. And if multiple members of the council were involved, then multiple members of the council will learn that attacking what's mine carries consequences their limited imaginations can't conceive. He finally looked up, his expression carved from ice. I let my father's enemies think he was predictable. They murdered him because they believed they understood his patterns. I won't repeat that mistake. They want to see what happens when I stop being calculated? I'll show them calculation so cold it makes my father's brutality look merciful. Marcus pulled up a chair, settling into the strategic discussion with practiced ease. They had done this countless times before, planning responses to threats both real and theoretical. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the rage beneath Kaedric's control was personal rather than political. That made him more dangerous and potentially more vulnerable. The arson investigation will take days, Marcus said. We need something immediate to demonstrate strength. Oh, agreed. Tomorrow morning, I want every business owned by members of the Noble Council inspected for regulatory violations. Tax fraud. Labor abuses. Contraband. I don't care what you find. I want legal justification to seize assets. Kaedric marked another map location. Start with Pemberton's shipping fleet. He's the loudest and the weakest. Make an example that the others can't ignore. That's economic warfare. That's the opening move. If they respond with violence, I escalate to military action. If they respond with politics, I escalate to exposing corruption. Either way, they learn that targeting what's mine means losing what's theirs. They worked through the night, building a strategy that was part punishment and part deterrent. By the time dawn light began filtering through the study windows, they had created a plan comprehensive enough to dismantle the Noble Council's power base while maintaining legal justification for every action. It was brilliant, it was ruthless, and it would work because Kaedric had spent his entire life preparing for exactly this kind of calculated destruction. The sun rose over Valamont, painting snow-covered rooftops in shades of pink and gold. From his window, Kaedric could see the entire kingdom spread before him. Every building, every street, every life lived in the shadow of Blackthorn Keep. This was his responsibility, his burden. His empire built on the foundation his father had created and refined through intelligence his father had lacked. But as he stood there watching morning transform darkness into day, his mind returned to Seraphina, to the way she had looked at him beside the burning house, to the question she had asked that he couldn't answer. What is this between us? He didn't know. That terrified him more than any conspiracy or assassination attempt. Not knowing meant loss of control. Loss of control meant vulnerability. Vulnerability meant death. This was the equation that had governed his entire life. This was the truth that had kept him alive when smarter, stronger, better men had fallen. But when he thought about her, none of that mattered. When he remembered the way she challenged him, the way she saw through his carefully constructed defenses, the way she made him feel human instead of powerful, none of the equations added up correctly. A knock at the door. Marcus had left an hour ago to begin implementing their strategy. This would be something new, something that required immediate attention. Enter, Ishii. Baseets, a messenger, young and nervous. Your Grace, a letter arrived, marked urgent and private. Kaedric took the sealed parchment. The wax bore no identifying mark. He broke it open, reading the contents once, then again to confirm what his mind refused to accept. The letter was from Seraphina. Duke Raventhorn, by the time you read this, I will have left Valamont. Please don't follow me. Please don't send people to find me. What happened tonight proved something we both already knew. I make you vulnerable, and you make me a target. Neither of us can afford those truths. You asked what this is between us. I'll tell you. It's the kind of thing that destroys kingdoms when rulers forget that power and love can't coexist. Your father died because he never learned to trust anyone. Don't let caring about me turn you into a different kind of monster, one who burns the world to protect what he can't control. Be the Duke Valamont needs, not the man I want you to be. Serafina. Kedrick read the letter a third time, then a fourth. The words didn't change. She was gone. She had left to protect him, to protect herself, to prevent the destruction her presence in his life would inevitably cause. The logical part of his mind acknowledged the wisdom in her decision. She was right. They made each other vulnerable. Her presence created leverage his enemies could exploit. Her absence removed that weakness, restored his strategic advantage, allowed him to focus on governance without the distraction of personal attachment. The logical part of his mind understood all of this perfectly. The rest of him wanted to tear the kingdom apart until he found her. Kedrick stood absolutely still in his study, while dawn light filled the room and his carefully ordered world collapsed into chaos. Below him, Valamont continued its morning routine. Markets opened. Guards changed shifts. Life proceeded with mechanical certainty. Everything was exactly as it had been yesterday. Except everything had changed. Because for the first time in his life, Duke Kedrick Raventhorn had found something he couldn't control, couldn't manipulate, couldn't force into submission through strategy or strength or systematic brutality. And she had walked away. The letter crumpled in his fist. His other hand gripped the window frame hard enough to leave marks in the wood. Behind him, the messenger waited for instructions that didn't come. Outside, his kingdom awaited orders from a duke who had temporarily forgotten how to think past the roaring in his ears. Marcus burst through the door without knocking, his face grim. "We have a problem. House Mordain just mobilized their army. They're marching toward our western border with enough force to level everything between here and the coast." Kedrick turned from the window slowly. His expression was empty, hollowed out. When he spoke, his voice carried no emotion at all. "Good. I was wondering who I should destroy first." The war room filled with men who pretended they weren't afraid. Kedrick stood at the head of the table, the crumpled letter still in his pocket, its weight somehow heavier than the strategic map spread before him. Marcus had summoned the military commanders within minutes of receiving confirmation that House Mordain's army was 3 days from the western border. Now, they all stood waiting for orders from a duke whose attention seemed fractured between the present crisis and something no one could name. General Thorne spoke first, his weathered face creased with concern. "Your Grace, their force is substantial. 15,000 infantry, 3,000 cavalry, siege engines. This isn't a border skirmish. This is invasion." Kedrick studied the map without seeing it. His mind kept returning to Serafina's words. "Be the Duke Valamont needs, not the man I want you to be." She had left because staying made him vulnerable. She had walked away to protect him from his own weakness. The logic was sound. The execution was flawless. And it made him want to burn the entire kingdom to ash. "Your Grace?" Marcus's voice cut through the fog. "We need to discuss defensive positions." Kedrick looked up. Every face in the room watched him with varying degrees of worry. They had never seen him like this before. Distant, unfocused. The Duke who always had a plan standing silent, while an enemy army marched toward their territory. "No defensive positions." His voice came out flat. "We mobilize offensive forces immediately. Full strength." The commanders exchanged glances. General Thorne leaned forward. "Your Grace, our intelligence suggests they have numerical superiority. A defensive strategy utilizing the mountain passes would give them time to establish siege positions and supply lines." Kedrick's focus snapped back with surgical precision. "Would allow them to dictate the terms of engagement. Would make us reactive instead of aggressive. We don't defend. We attack before they're fully positioned. We hit them while they're still marching through open territory where their numbers become a liability rather than an advantage." Marcus nodded slowly. "Aggressive, risky, possibly brilliant. Definitely necessary." Kadric placed both hands on the table, leaning over the maps. House Mordan thinks they're punishing me for rejecting their alliance proposal. They think this is about politics and trade routes and noble pride. They're wrong. This is about testing whether I'm weak enough to be conquered. We're going to answer that question definitively.
What about the Noble Council? Commander Valens, younger and more politically aware than the others, voiced the concern everyone was thinking. If we commit our forces west, they might use the opportunity to let them try. Kadric's smile held no warmth. Anyone who moves against me while I'm defending Valamont from external invasion becomes a traitor. Traitors hang from the walls of Blackthorn Keep until the crows finish with them. Make sure that information reaches every member of the council by noon. The room fell silent. This was the Duke they recognized. Cold, calculated, capable of transforming political complications into corpses with the same ease other men sign documents. General Thorne, mobilize 8,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry. I want them ready to march within 12 hours. Kadric's finger traced routes on the map. Commander Valens,
take 500 of your best riders and scout ahead. I need terrain reports and enemy positioning updated every 6 hours. Marcus, you'll command the fortress garrison in my absence. Marcus straightened. Your absence? I'm leading the assault personally. The room erupted in protests. Generals who had fought beside his father tried to explain tactical stupidity. Commanders who had sworn oaths to protect him outlined every reason why dukes remained in fortresses during wartime. Marcus simply stared at him with an expression that said he understood exactly what was happening and hated it. Kadric waited until the noise died down. When he spoke, his voice carried absolute finality. House Mordain invaded because they believe I'm distracted, compromised, weak. If I hide in my fortress while sending others to fight, I confirm their assessment. If I lead from the front, I prove that whatever personal complications exist don't affect my capacity for violence. This isn't about tactics. This is about reputation. And if you die? Marcus's question cut through the strategic rationalization. Then you execute every member of the Noble Council and establish military governance until someone competent claims the succession. Kadric met his oldest friend's eyes without flinching. But I won't die. House Mordain brought an army designed to conquer territory. I'm bringing an army designed to destroy theirs. There's a difference. He dismissed them with a gesture. They filed out slowly, men who understood orders even when they disagreed with them. Only Marcus remained, standing across the table with his arms crossed and his expression grim. You're not doing this for reputation. It wasn't a question. I'm doing this because it's necessary. Kadric rolled up the maps with precise movements. Mordain invaded now because they received intelligence that I'm vulnerable. Someone in Valamont told them about Seraphina, about my reaction to the fire, about the fact that for the first time in my life, I made decisions based on emotion rather than strategy. So this is about proving you're still in control. This is about eliminating the perception that I can be manipulated through personal attachment. Kadric's hand stilled on the map. She left because she made me weak. The only way to undo that damage is to demonstrate that her absence doesn't affect my capacity for absolute brutality. Marcus moved around the table, his voice dropping. Or you could admit that you're doing this because violence is easier than feeling anything real. That going to war is simpler than confronting the fact that someone finally mattered enough to scare you. Your psychological assessment is noted and irrelevant. Kadric turned toward the door. Make sure the fortress is prepared for extended siege conditions. If Mordain has allies moving simultaneously, we need to be ready for complications. Kadric. Marcus rarely used his actual name. When he did, it carried weight that titles couldn't match. Don't get yourself killed trying to prove you don't care about her. Kadric paused at the threshold. I care about Valamont. Everything else is distraction. He left before Marcus could respond. The corridor outside stretched toward his private chambers, empty except for guards who saluted as he passed. His mind was already moving through logistical necessities. Weapons, armor, supplies. the mechanical preparation for war that occupied the space where emotions might otherwise intrude. Inside his chambers, servants had already begun packing. News traveled through Blackthorn Keep faster than rumors through market squares. Everyone knew the Duke was marching to war. Everyone understood what that meant. The last time a Raventhorn led troops personally, the enemy kingdom ceased to exist. Caedric dismissed the servants and dressed himself. Leather armor worn soft from use. Chainmail that moved like fabric. The sword his father had carried into battle, its blade etched with names of defeated enemies. Each piece was familiar, comfortable. A return to the simplicity of violence where problems had solutions delivered through superior force. He was fastening the last buckle when he noticed the small wooden box on his desk. Plain, unremarkable. Definitely not his. He approached cautiously, hand on his sword, mind cataloging potential threats. Poison, explosive, trap. The box was small enough to hold any of them. Inside was a silver ring. Nothing else? No note? No explanation. Just a ring that he recognized immediately because he had seen it on Seraphina's hand during every conversation they had shared. She wore it on her right index finger, a family heirloom from the house that had fallen before she was old enough to remember prosperity. Caedric lifted it slowly, studying the worn engraving. Her family crest, barely visible after generations of wear. She had left it for him. Why? Message? Warning? Reminder? He turned it over in his palm, feeling the weight of silver and implication. The door opened without knocking. Marcus again, his expression urgent. We have a visitor. You need to see this. I gave orders not to be disturbed. It's Lady Seraphina's maid. She's demanding to speak with you about her mistress's disappearance. And Caedric... Marcus hesitated. She's claiming Seraphina didn't leave voluntarily. Everything stopped. The room. His breathing. The careful control he had maintained since reading that letter. Caedric's hand closed around the ring hard enough to feel the metal bite into his palm. Bring her to the study. Now. 3 minutes later, the maid stood before his desk, wringing her hands and fighting tears. She was older, maybe 50, with the weathered face of someone who had served fallen nobility long enough to understand discretion. But discretion had limits. Whatever she knew had pushed her past them. Your Grace, I apologize for the intrusion, but Lady Seraphina wouldn't have wanted... Her voice cracked. She didn't write that letter. Caedric placed both hands flat on the desk. Explained. The handwriting was hers, but the words weren't. She was forced to write it. I heard them in the house after the fire. 3 men. They told her if she didn't leave the city and write that letter, they would burn more than buildings. They would start with the orphanage where she volunteers, then the temple district, then... The maid's composure shattered completely. They gave her 2 hours. She wrote the letter, she left. But Your Grace, she was crying the entire time. Those weren't her words. The study became very quiet. Outside, morning sounds of a fortress preparing for war continued. Inside, Caedric felt something cold and surgical take over the space where rational thought usually operated. These men, describe them. I only saw one clearly. Tall, scar across his left cheek. Military bearing. He wore a ring with a serpent design. House Mordain colors. Marcus moved to the window, his hand on his sword. This wasn't random intimidation. This was coordinated extraction designed to look voluntary. Caedric stood slowly. His movements were deliberate, controlled, the kind of control that preceded violence so comprehensive it became art. They took her. It appears so, Your Grace. They forced her to write that letter so I would believe she chose to leave. So I would focus on the invasion instead of searching for her. So I would think she walked away to protect me when, in reality, they removed her to eliminate my distraction before attacking. His voice remained perfectly level. That's elegant strategy. Credit where it's due. Caedric, where is she now? He addressed the maid directly. I don't know, Your Grace. They had a carriage waiting. I followed as far as I could. They headed north toward the mountain passes, but that was last night. They could be anywhere by now. North toward the mountains, toward Mordain territory. They had taken her across the border before launching their invasion. Insurance, leverage, a pressure point they could exploit if the war turned against them. Standard tactical thinking for men who understood that battles were won through psychology as much as steel. They had made one critical miscalculation. They assumed taking her would weaken him, make him desperate, force him into mistakes. They were partially right. It had made him desperate, but desperation didn't make men like Cadric Raventhorn weak. It made them lethal. Marcus, change of orders. Cadric's voice carried the flat certainty of absolute decision. Mobilize everything, every soldier, every rider. Empty the fortress garrison down to skeleton crews. I want overwhelming force ready to march within 6 hours. That leaves Blackthorn Keep vulnerable. The keep can burn for all I care. Cadric moved toward the weapons wall, selecting additional blades with practiced efficiency. House Mordain invaded Valamon and abducted a citizen under my protection. That's not war. That's suicide. We're going to teach them the difference. What about the Noble Council? If we commit all our forces, the Noble Council can join Mordain in extinction if they're stupid enough to move against me now. He buckled the additional weapons into place. Send riders to every major house. Tell them Duke Raventhorn is marching to war. Tell them any house that contributes troops to this campaign will receive favorable trade agreements for the next decade. Tell them any house that remains neutral will be considered complicit with kidnapping and invasion. Give them 2 hours to decide. Oh! Marcus absorbed the orders without question. Years of friendship had taught him when argument was possible and when Cadric had moved beyond reach of reason. And when we find Lady Seraphina, when we find her, I'm going to demonstrate exactly what happens when someone mistakes my restraint for weakness. Cadric turned from the weapons wall. Osan. Cadric turned from them, his eyes carrying something Marcus had never seen before. Not rage, not fury, something colder and infinitely more dangerous. My father ruled through fear. I thought I was smarter, more strategic, better at balancing respect and intimidation. But maybe he was right all along. Maybe the only language worth speaking is the one written in blood. That's not you talking. That's the man who's going to get her back. Cadric moved past him toward the door. Prepare the troops. We march at sundown. The next 6 hours transform Blackthorn Keep from fortress to war machine. Soldiers assembled in the massive courtyard, their armor catching afternoon sun, their faces showing the grim determination of men who understood their duke had moved past political maneuvering into something far more primitive. Supply wagons lined up in precise formations. Horses stamped and snorted, sensing the collective tension. Blacksmiths worked overtime, sharpening blades that would taste blood before the week ended. Cadric stood on the ramparts, watching the preparation below. Beside him, General Thorn reviewed tactical options with professional detachment. If they're holding her in Mordain territory, extraction becomes complicated. Their fortress at Ravencross is heavily fortified. Direct assault would cost thousands of casualties. Then we'll pay that cost. Cadric's gaze remained fixed on the assembling army. Calculate for total warfare, no retreat, no negotiation. We hit them with everything until they surrender her or cease to exist as a functional military force. Your Grace, with respect, that strategy risks some. I don't care what it risks. Cadric finally looked at the general. House Mordain made this personal when they took her. They calculated that I would respond emotionally. They were right. But they assumed emotion would make me cautious. They were wrong. We're going to march into their territory and burn everything that stands between me and her location. If that means destroying their entire military, so be it. If that means executing their leadership, even better. They wanted to see what happens when Duke Raventhorn stops being diplomatic. They're going to get that lesson. General Thorn nodded slowly. He had served 2 Raventhorns. He recognized the family madness when it surfaced. The troops will be ready by sundown, Your Grace. Good. Make sure they understand the objective isn't territorial conquest. We're not there to occupy. We're there to destroy and retrieve. Speed and violence, nothing else matters. The general departed, leaving Cadric alone with his thoughts and the growing army below. The rational part of his mind acknowledged the enormous gamble he was taking. Committing all forces to aggressive warfare in enemy territory violated every principle of defensive strategy. If the Noble Council moved against him, if other houses saw opportunity in his absence, if Mordain had allies waiting for exactly this scenario, Valamont would be vulnerable.
He didn't care. Serafina had accused him once of ruling through fear because fear was the only language he trusted. She was right. But she had also shown him something else. That power without purpose was just noise. That control without humanity was just survival. That everything he had built meant nothing if he couldn't protect the one person who made him feel human. So he would burn Mordain to the ground. He would sacrifice strategic advantage for personal retrieval. He would prove to everyone watching that taking what belonged to Duke Cadric Raventhorn carried consequences that made war look merciful. And if that made him his father's son after all, so be it. Marcus appeared at his elbow, his presence announced by familiar footsteps. The noble council sent a representative, Lord Vexler. He's requesting audience. Isam, Iam, Jad Basars. How polite. I assume he's here to explain why his colleagues thought abducting Serafina was acceptable strategy. He claims ignorance of any abduction, says the council had nothing to do with Mordain's invasion, wants to negotiate terms for supporting your campaign in exchange for political concessions. Marcus's tone suggested exactly what he thought of those claims. Bring him up. Cadric remained at the rampart, watching his army finalize preparation. Let's hear what kind of lies he's selling today. Lord Vexler arrived 5 minutes later, his usual composure slightly cracked. He bowed formally, his movements precise despite obvious nervousness. Your Grace, thank you for seeing me under these difficult circumstances. You have 2 minutes. Speak. Vexler straightened, choosing his words carefully. The Council wishes to express solidarity with Valamont during this unprovoked aggression. House Mordain's actions are inexcusable. We're prepared to mobilize additional forces to support your campaign. In exchange for what? Merely recognition that the Council serves as valuable advisory body, that certain decisions benefit from collective wisdom rather than singular authority, that perhaps arrangements could be made regarding my personal life. Cadric turned to face him directly. You want to use this crisis to extract political concessions. You want me to agree that my marriage, my alliances, my private decisions become subject to council approval. In exchange, you'll provide troops that I don't need to fight a war. I'm winning regardless. Vexler's expression flickered. Your Grace, I'm simply suggesting that cooperation might... Did you know they took her? The question cut like a blade. I don't understand. Lady Serafina, did you know House Mordain abducted her? Did you know they forced her to write that letter? Did any member of your council have advance knowledge that an invasion was coming? Cadric descended from the rampart, moving toward Vexler with deliberate slowness. Choose your next words very carefully. They determine whether you walk out of here or get thrown from these walls. Shit. Vexler paled. Your Grace, I swear on my family name, the council had no knowledge of any abduction. We knew Mordain was upset about the rejected alliance. We knew they were positioning troops, but we believed it was posturing, not actual invasion. And we certainly didn't know about Lady Serafina. But you knew someone was targeting her. It wasn't a question. Silence stretched between them. Below, soldiers continued their preparation, unaware of the confrontation happening on the ramparts above. Finally, Vexler nodded fractionally. After the fire, there was talk. Speculation about who might benefit from removing her influence. Some council members suggested it sent an appropriate message about respecting tradition. I argued against it. Others were less diplomatic. His voice dropped. But if someone coordinated with Mordain to actually abduct her, that wasn't sanctioned council action. That was individual conspiracy. Names. Your Grace, without proof, sus. Names. Now. Or I throw you off these walls and extract them from whoever survives you. Vexler's composure cracked completely. Lord Pemberton, Lord Blackwood, possibly Lord Hastings. They were the loudest about finding ways to pressure you regarding marriage alliances. But I never heard them discuss abduction, just political maneuvering, economic pressure, standard aristocratic games. Standard aristocratic games just became treason. Cadric moved past him toward the stairs. Marcus, arrest Lord Pemberton and Lord Blackwood, seize their estates and assets, place them in the lower dungeons pending formal charges of conspiracy with foreign powers. Your Grace, Vexler's protest came out strangled. Without trial, without evidence beyond speculation, they'll get their trial. After I return from Mordain. If they're innocent, they'll be released with apologies and compensation. If they're guilty, they'll hang from chains long enough for the entire kingdom to understand what happens to traitors. Kadric paused at the top of the stairs. You have a choice, Vexler. You can continue defending your colleagues and join them in the dungeons, or you can provide every piece of information you have about council communications with House Mordain over the past month. I'll cooperate fully, Your Grace. Excellent. Marcus will take your statement. If it leads to Seraphina's location, you'll be rewarded. If it wastes my time, you'll regret it. Dismissed. Vexler fled with as much dignity as terror allowed. Marcus watched him go, then turned to Kadric with an expression mixing concern and resignation. You're arresting members of the Noble Council without formal charges. I'm protecting Valamont from internal threats while responding to external invasion. That's literally the definition of my authority. It's also exactly the kind of tyrannical overreach that made people hate your father. Then they can hate me too. Kadric continued down the stairs toward the courtyard. I'm done pretending politics matters more than results. The Noble Council thought they could manipulate me through careful pressure. Mordain thought they could weaken me by taking her. They're both about to learn that restraint isn't weakness, and patience isn't fear. I'm going to show them what actual tyranny looks like. And when this is over, when you've burned Mordain and arrested half the council and demonstrated that crossing you means annihilation, what then? Kadric reached the courtyard, moving through assembled soldiers toward his horse. Then everyone in Valamont understands the new rules. Obey or die. Cooperate or suffer. Challenge me and watch everything you love turn to ash. My father taught me that fear creates order. I tried to improve on his methods. Clearly, that was a mistake. Seraphina wouldn't want this. Marcus's words stopped him mid-stride. She walked away, was taken away, specifically to prevent you from becoming this, from sacrificing everything you built for revenge disguised as rescue. She doesn't get to decide what I become. Kadric mounted his horse, the animal responding immediately to his weight and presence. Neither do you. Mordain invaded my kingdom and took someone under my protection. That's all that matters. Everything else is just noise. He raised his hand, silencing the courtyard. 10,000 soldiers fell quiet, their attention focused on the Duke sitting tall in his saddle, his face carved from stone and determination. House Mordain believes we're weak. They believe our Duke is distracted by personal complications. They believe Valamont can be conquered because our leadership has grown soft. His voice carried across the assembled troops without effort. We're going to correct their misunderstanding. We march to Mordain territory not to defend our borders, but to destroy their capacity for warfare. We go not as peacekeepers, but as executioners. Every soldier who stands against us dies. Every fortification that blocks our path burns. Every officer who gave orders for this invasion hangs. We don't negotiate. We don't accept surrender until our objective is achieved. We take back what was stolen and leave nothing behind but examples. The soldiers responded with a roar that shook the fortress walls. These were men bred for war, trained for violence, waiting their entire lives for a leader who would unleash them without restraint. Duke Kadric Raventhorn had just given them permission to become the monsters that civilized society pretended didn't exist. The gates of Blackthorn Keep opened like the jaws of some massive predator. The army poured through in organized columns, their movement precise despite the aggressive speed. Cavalry units fanned out to scout ahead. Infantry marched in tight formations designed for rapid deployment. Supply wagons followed at intervals calculated to support sustained warfare without slowing advance. Kadric rode at the front, Marcus beside him, both men silent as Valamont's military might descended from the fortress toward the western territories and the war waiting beyond. Behind them, the keep stood empty save for minimal garrison forces. Before them, 3 days of forced march separated them from Mordain's invasion force and whatever fortress held Seraphina. The sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting snow-covered mountains in shades of blood and gold. Kadric watched it fall, his mind moving through contingencies and probabilities. Mordain's army had marched openly, confident in their numbers and strategy. That confidence would be their weakness. They expected defensive warfare, sieges, negotiations. The slow grinding approach of armies that valued preservation over victory.
They wouldn't expect Valamont's full military force crashing into them with the singular objective of complete annihilation. They wouldn't anticipate a duke who had moved past strategic thinking into something far more dangerous: personal vendetta, backed by absolute authority. Night fell as they marched, the army carrying torches that turned the landscape into a river of fire flowing west. Scouts returned periodically with updates. Mordain's forces had stopped to establish camp 40 miles ahead. They were settling in for siege preparation, building fortifications, organizing supply lines. Everything by the book. Everything predictable. Everything wrong. Kaedric called a halt 3 hours before dawn. The army made cold camp. No fires that might reveal position or numbers. Soldiers rested where they stopped, veteran discipline keeping them quiet despite obvious exhaustion. Officers moved through the ranks, distributing rations and checking equipment. In the command tent, Kaedric studied maps by covered lantern light. General Thorne pointed out terrain features while Marcus reviewed scout reports. The picture was clear. Mordain expected them to arrive in 3 days. Expected defensive positioning. Expected negotiation. We hit them at dawn. Kedric's finger traced attack routes. 3-pronged assault. Cavalry from the north and south, infantry straight through their center. They're not expecting us for days. They won't have proper defensive perimeters established. We'll be on them before they can form effective resistance. That's not warfare, Your Grace. General Thorne's voice carried professional concern. That's slaughter.
Correct. Kedric looked up from the maps. That's the point. We're not here to fight honorably.
We're here to destroy them so completely that every other kingdom within 1,000 miles hears what happened and never considers crossing Valamont again. And prisoners? Interrogate them for information about Seraphina's location. Those who cooperate get quick deaths. Those who don't get imaginative ones. Make sure the survivors understand that the only thing worse than facing Valamont in battle is taking something that belongs to its duke. The general nodded grimly and departed to brief unit commanders. Marcus remained, his expression unreadable in the dim light. You've crossed a line tonight. Several of them. Kedric rolled up the maps. Your point? Shut us. My point is that you're burning down everything you spent a decade building. The reputation for harsh but fair governance. The respect you earned through strategic brilliance instead of mindless brutality. All of it disappearing because you can't separate personal obsession from political responsibility. Is there anything else? Kedric's voice remained level despite the anger building beneath. Any other philosophical observations about my failures? Any other wisdom about restraint and responsibility? Just one. Marcus leaned forward. She wouldn't want this version of you, the man who tears kingdoms apart because someone touched what he considers his. The ruler who abandons everything he believes to prove he can be as cruel as his father. When you find her, if you find her, what are you going to tell her about the thousands who died so you could feel powerful again? Kedric stood slowly. Kedric stood. The tent suddenly felt too small for the rage contained within it. Get out! Kedric, get out! The words came out quiet and lethal. I don't need a conscience. I need a captain of the guard who follows orders. If you can't be that, I'll find someone who can. Marcus held his gaze for a long moment. Then he turned and left without another word, leaving Kaedric alone with his maps and his rage, and the knowledge that every accusation was deserved. He extinguished the lantern and stood in darkness, feeling the weight of command and choice and consequence. Marcus was right. He had crossed lines, abandoned principles, become the thing he had sworn never to be. All for a woman who had tried to protect him by leaving, who had been taken specifically because his enemies recognized her as his weakness, who would probably hate what he had become in her absence. He didn't care. Let her hate him. Let Marcus judge him. Let the entire kingdom whisper about the duke who proved to be his father's son after all. None of it mattered as much as getting her back. None of it outweighed the simple equation that had replaced strategic thinking. They took her, so they would burn. Dawn came cold and gray. The army assembled in prearranged positions, moving with the silent efficiency of professionals who understood their trade. Cavalry units flanked north and south, invisible in the pre-dawn darkness. Infantry formed up at the center, shields locked and weapons ready. Archers positioned themselves on elevated terrain, their arrows ready to black out the sky. Kedrick sat on his horse at the front of the center column, watching the eastern horizon lighten incrementally. Beside him, General Thorne waited for the signal to attack. Behind them, 10,000 soldiers prepared to do what they had trained their entire lives for: kill on command. The sun broke over the mountains. Light spilled across the landscape, revealing Mordaine's encampment spread below like pieces on a game board. They were still sleeping, still confident, still alive for a few more minutes. Kedrick raised his sword. The blade caught the dawn light, signaling the cavalry to begin their approach. Then he lowered it, pointing directly at the enemy camp. The army surged forward like a wave of steel and fury. The sound of 10,000 boots hitting frozen ground created thunder that woke Mordaine's soldiers too late to matter. Cavalry crashed into their flanks while they were still reaching for weapons. Infantry hit their center before they could form defensive lines. Archers released volley after volley into the chaos, finding targets with brutal efficiency. It wasn't a battle. It was execution set to the screams of men who had underestimated their enemy. Kedrick rode into the center of it all, his sword finding flesh with mechanical precision. His mind emptied of everything except movement and violence and the grim satisfaction of watching his enemies fall. This was what power really meant. Not political maneuvering, not careful strategy. Just superior force deployed without hesitation or mercy. The fight lasted less than an hour. When it ended, Mordaine's invasion force had ceased to exist as anything but corpses and prisoners. Their siege equipment burned, their supplies were seized. Their commanders knelt in a line before Kedrick's horse, their faces showing the dawning comprehension that they had made a fatal miscalculation. Kedrick dismounted, walking slowly along the line of captured officers. His sword dripped red. His armor was spattered with evidence of close combat. He stopped in front of what appeared to be their senior commander, a gray-haired man whose face showed more resignation than fear. "Where is she?" The commander met his eyes without flinching.
"I don't know who you mean, Your Grace."
Kedrick's sword moved faster than thought. The commander's left ear fell to the ground. Blood poured from the wound. The man gasped, but didn't scream. "Where is Lady Seraphina Vale?"
"I don't—" The sentence ended in a scream as Kedrick's blade took the right ear as well.
"You coordinated with someone in Valamont to have her abducted. You timed your invasion to coincide with her removal. You believed taking her would weaken my response to your aggression."
Kedrick's voice remained conversational despite the violence. "You were partially right. It weakened my restraint. Now, where is she?" The commander's composure shattered. "Ravencross."
"Lord Mordaine's fortress at Ravencross. She's being held in the Eastern Tower under heavy guard. I swear that's all I know." Kedrick nodded once. Then he drove his sword through the man's heart, killing him instantly. The other captured officers flinched. He turned to face them, his blade still wet. "Anyone else want to tell me what I already know?" The youngest officer, barely 20, started babbling. "She's alive. Lord Mordaine ordered her kept comfortable. He said she was insurance. In case the invasion failed, he could negotiate terms for her return. Please, Your Grace, that's everything. Thank you for your cooperation." Kedrick executed him as well. Quick, clean, merciful compared to what he wanted to do. "The rest of you will be taken back to Valamont. You'll stand trial for invasion and conspiracy. If you're lucky, you'll hang quickly. If you're not, you'll learn what happens when you make Duke Raventhorn's enemies list." He turned to General Thorne. "Leave 1,000 troops to secure this position and manage prisoners. The rest of us march on Ravencross immediately. No rest, no delay. We hit them before word of this massacre reaches their fortress. Your Grace, the troops need to recover. They just fought a major engagement. Pushing them directly into another assault is exactly what we're doing." Kedrick cleaned his blade on a fallen banner. "Mordaine thinks they still have leverage, thinks they can negotiate because they hold Seraphina. We're going to arrive at their gates before they realize that leverage just became a death sentence." The army reformed with grim efficiency. Exhausted soldiers who should have rested instead picked up weapons and prepared to march another 20 miles toward the fortress, where their enemies made their final stand. This was beyond ordinary military campaign now. This was religious fervor channeled through disciplined violence. Duke Raventhorn had become something beyond a commander. He had become a force of nature aimed at a single objective, and everyone marching behind him understood that nothing would stop him short of death. They reached Ravencross at sunset. The fortress sat on a promontory overlooking a river valley, its walls built from black stone that gave it the appearance of something carved from the mountain itself. Banners bearing House Mordaine's serpent sigil flew from the towers. Guards walked the ramparts, unaware that their invasion force had been annihilated and their doom was approaching. Cedric halted his army just out of arrow range. The fortress was formidable. Direct assault would cost thousands. Siege would take weeks. Negotiation might actually work given that they held Seraphina as leverage. He chose violence. Bring the siege engines forward. I want those gates down before midnight. Archers, target anything that moves on those walls. Infantry, prepare for breach assault. He paused, his eyes fixed on the eastern tower where Seraphina was supposedly being held. Anyone who harms her before we extract her will beg for death long before I grant it. Make sure that message reaches Lord Mordaine personally. A rider was sent forward under flag of truce. Cedric watched him approach the gates, deliver the message, and return. 10 minutes later, the fortress's main gates opened partially. A figure emerged, surrounded by guards, moving to speaking distance. Lord Mordaine himself, tall, aristocratic, stupid enough to believe he still controlled this situation. Duke Raventhorn, let us speak as reasonable men about, You have 10 minutes to surrender Lady Seraphina unharmed, or I reduce your fortress to rubble. Cedric's voice carried across the distance. Those are the only terms available. Be reasonable. Your Grace, we can negotiate. 9 minutes. You're destroying centuries of diplomatic tradition. We can reach an arrangement that benefits. 8 minutes. Every minute you waste is another section of wall that comes down. Every delay means more of your people die. I don't care about your fortress. I don't care about your house. I don't care if your entire bloodline ends tonight. All I care about is getting her back. You have 7 minutes. Lord Mordaine's composure cracked. She's unharmed. We never intended actual violence. This was simply political strategy. The first siege engine released. The massive stone projectile crashed into Ravencross's outer wall, demolishing a section of battlement. Debris and screaming guards fell into the darkness below. 6 minutes. Mordaine fled back to his fortress. The gates slammed shut. Soldiers on the walls scrambled into defensive positions. Inside, Cedric could imagine the panic as they realized that Duke Raventhorn wasn't negotiating, wasn't positioning for advantage, wasn't playing the aristocratic games that had governed conflict for generations. He was simply destroying everything until he got what he came for. The siege engines fired systematically. Each impact shook the fortress foundations. Each projectile opened new breaches in walls that had stood for centuries. Archers targeted anyone foolish enough to show themselves on the ramparts. Infantry waited with the patience of predators for the moment when the gates would fall and they could pour inside. 3 minutes before Cedric's deadline, the gates opened fully. Lord Mordaine emerged again, this time with a figure in silver beside him. Even at this distance, even in fading light, Cedric recognized her. Seraphina. Alive. Whole. Walking under her own power, but clearly restrained by guards on either side. Relief hit him with physical force, immediately followed by rage so intense it bordered on ecstasy. They had kept her locked away, had used her as leverage, had touched what was his. The consequences for that were going to be legendary. Your Grace, Mordaine's voice carried desperation now. As you can see, Lady Seraphina is unharmed. We release her to you immediately. Please, let us resolve this without further. Bring her here, slowly. Any sudden movements and my archers kill everyone on those walls, including you. And they walked forward at glacial pace. Cedric dismounted, moving to meet them halfway between his army and their fortress. Behind him, every soldier stood ready for betrayal. Before him, Seraphina approached with her head high despite obvious exhaustion. When they met, she looked at him with an expression mixing relief, anger, and something that might have been grief. Her first words weren't gratitude. You shouldn't have come. They took you. So you brought an army and destroyed anyone in your path. Her voice carried weary frustration. This is exactly what I tried to prevent, you becoming this. They took you, Cedric repeated slowly, as if explaining to a child. That made this response inevitable. Lord Mordaine interrupted nervously. Your Grace, now that you have Lady Seraphina, perhaps we can discuss.
Kedrick's hand moved to his sword. Seraphina stepped between them quickly. Don't. Please. Enough people have died tonight. Not nearly enough. But his hand stilled. Go to Marcus. He'll see you back to the medical tents. Kedrick, go. Now.
Before I change my mind about showing restraint. She held his gaze for one more moment. Then she turned and walked toward the Valemont lines, leaving him alone with Lord Mordaunt in the fortress full of enemies who had made the worst mistake of their lives.
Mordain tried one last time. Your Grace, you have what you came for. Let us end this. You coordinated with traitors in my own kingdom. You invaded my territory.
You abducted someone under my protection, and you thought you could negotiate away consequences. Kedrick drew his sword slowly. Your house ends tonight. Your fortress burns. Your name gets struck from every record, and you die knowing you brought this on yourself. Your Grace, please. The signal came before Mordain could finish begging. The army surged forward. Cavalry flanked around to cut off escape routes. Infantry hit the gates in an overwhelming wave. Archers covered the assault with volley after volley. Ravencross's garrison tried to mount defense, but they were demoralized, outnumbered, and facing an enemy that had moved beyond conventional warfare into extermination. Kedrick killed Lord Mordain personally. Quick, efficient. Then he walked through the breached gates into the fortress, his soldiers spreading through the corridors like a plague, systematically eliminating resistance. The eastern tower where they had held Seraphina burned first. Poetic justice administered through fire and screaming. By midnight, Ravencross had fallen completely. The fortress that had stood for 300 years was reduced to broken walls and corpses. House Mordain, one of the oldest noble lines in the region, ceased to exist. Every member of their family, every officer who had followed their orders, every soldier who had raised weapons against Valemont lay dead in the ruins. Kedrick stood in the center of the devastation, his sword red to the hilt, his armor dented from close combat, his mind emptied of everything except the cold satisfaction of absolute victory. Around him, his soldiers secured the position and tended to their wounded and prepared for the march home. This was what happened when someone took what belonged to Duke Kedrick Raventhorn. This was the lesson that would echo through every kingdom for the next generation. Not diplomacy, not negotiation, not political maneuvering, just consequences delivered with such overwhelming force that no one would ever make the same mistake again. Marcus found him as dawn broke over the ruins. His oldest friend's face showed exhaustion and something darker that might have been judgment. It's done, Laura. Yes. Kedrick sheathed his sword finally. Send word to Valemont. House Mordain is extinct. The invasion is crushed. We're returning home. And the prisoners from the council, Pemberton and Blackwood? Execute them, publicly. With full documentation of their conspiracy with Mordain, let everyone see what treason costs. You're creating enemies faster than you can destroy them. Then I'll keep destroying them until they learn. Kedrick turned from the ruins toward where his army was preparing to march. Where is she? Medical tent. She's unharmed physically, emotionally. Marcus hesitated. She watched you burn an entire fortress to get her back. She saw what you're capable of when control slips. I don't think she knows what to feel. What That makes two of us. Kedrick started walking, his body operating on instinct since his mind had emptied somewhere between killing Mordain and watching his fortress burn. Keep the army ready to march. We leave in 6 hours. He found Seraphina sitting outside the medical tent, wrapped in a cloak too large for her, staring at nothing. She looked up as he approached, her expression unreadable. You destroyed them. Yes. You killed everyone. Not everyone. The servants and civilians were spared. Just the soldiers and nobles who made the decisions. That's still hundreds of people dead because of me. No. Kedrick sat beside her, close enough to feel her warmth, distant enough to respect the space she might need. They're dead because they made choices that carried consequences. They invaded. They took you. They believed I could be manipulated. They were wrong. I never wanted this. Her voice cracked slightly. I left specifically to prevent you from becoming this, from sacrificing everything you built for revenge disguised as rescue. You didn't leave. They took you.
He reached into his pocket, pulling out the silver ring she had left behind. But first you tried to protect me, to remove yourself as a vulnerability. That was noble, strategic, exactly what someone raised in fallen aristocracy would do to survive. He held the ring out to her. It was also completely useless because the moment they touched you, none of the strategy mattered anymore. She took the ring slowly, turning it over in her palm. What happens now? Now we go home. I execute the traitors who coordinated with Mordain. I rebuild whatever political capital I destroyed during this campaign, and I figure out how to rule a kingdom that now fears me as much as it feared my father. That's not what I meant. Serafina looked at him directly, her eyes searching his face. What happens with us, after all this? After you proved you'd burn the world rather than lose me? Kedrick had no answer. He had tactical responses and strategic deflections, and a dozen ways to avoid the question. But sitting there in the ruins of the fortress he had destroyed, covered in the blood of hundreds of enemies, he found that none of the careful words mattered. I don't know, but I know I can't let you go again. Even if it makes me vulnerable, even if it gives enemies leverage, even if it turns me into something worse than my father ever was. He paused, forcing himself to speak the truth he had buried beneath strategy and violence. You make me human, weak, irrational. Every terrible thing Marcus accused me of being, and I'd rather be that than go back to being just powerful. Serafina's expression softened fractionally. That's possibly the most terrifying thing you've ever said to me. I know, and the most honest. I know that too. She stood slowly, the oversized cloak falling around her like a shroud. I need time to process what happened, what you did, what we both became during this. Take whatever time you need, but take it in Valamont, where I can protect you from whoever comes next. You can't protect me from yourself. The words should have been harsh. Instead, they sounded sad. That's what tonight proved. You're the greatest threat to my safety because you'll destroy everything rather than lose me. That's not love, Kedrick. That's obsession. Maybe, but it's the only version I know how to feel. He stood as well, maintaining the careful distance between them. Come home. Figure out whatever you need to figure out. If you decide you can't be with someone who burned a fortress to retrieve you, I'll respect that decision, but make it from safety rather than ruins. She nodded slowly. Then she walked past him toward the camp where his soldiers prepared to march, leaving him standing alone in the gray dawn light, with the ruins of House Mordain surrounding him like a monument to exactly how dangerous he became when someone touched what he claimed as his. The march back to Valamont took 3 days. Kedrick rode at the front of his army, Serafina safely positioned in the middle, surrounded by guards who had orders to die before letting anyone near her. They didn't speak during the journey. She processed whatever trauma came with being abducted and used as leverage. He processed whatever remained of the man he had been before love and violence collided into something unrecognizable. When Blackthorn Keep finally came into view, the fortress looked exactly as they had left it. Strong, imposing, built to endure anything except the collapse of whoever sat at its center. The gates opened to receive their returning army. Citizens lined the streets, cheering victory and conquest, and the demonstration that Valamont remained unconquerable under Raventhorn rule. They didn't know the cost yet. Didn't understand that their duke had crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. Didn't realize that the man riding through those gates had become something his enemies feared and his allies questioned, and the woman he loved couldn't decide whether to stay with or run from. In the great hall where his father had ruled through systematic brutality, where Kedrick had promised himself he would be better and smarter and more strategic, he now stood alone with the knowledge that he had failed every promise he had made. He had become his father after all. Serafina had been right. She made him vulnerable, made him irrational, made him capable of destroying centuries of diplomatic tradition because someone had touched what he considered his. And the terrifying part wasn't that he had done it. The terrifying part was that he would do it again without hesitation if anyone threatened her. That was the truth he would have to live with. The understanding that power and humanity couldn't coexist in someone like him. That caring about someone made him more dangerous rather than less. That every choice from here forward would be complicated by the simple fact that Duke Kedrick Raventhorn had finally found something that mattered more than strategy.
and kingdoms burned when rulers stopped calculating consequences. Outside his study windows, Valamont settled into evening routines. Life continued with mechanical certainty for people who didn't know their duke had fundamentally changed, who didn't understand that the careful balance between strength and restraint had shattered somewhere between finding her gone and burning Ravencross to ash. The door opened behind him. He didn't turn. Only one person would enter without permission now.
Seraphina's voice carried quiet resignation. We need to talk about what comes next. I know. You can't keep ruling like this.
Through rage and revenge and burning everything that challenges you. I know that too. But you're not going to stop. Not a question. Cedric finally turned to face her. She stood in the doorway, still wearing that oversized cloak, her expression showing someone who had looked at darkness and recognized it rather than running. I'm going to try to find some version of myself that can protect you without destroying everything else. But I won't promise success. Because the truth is, when they took you, I stopped being the Duke who calculated consequences. I became something simpler and infinitely more dangerous, and I don't know how to go back. Then we move forward. She stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. Not backward to who you were, not deeper into who you became. Somewhere different, together, if that's even possible after everything that happened. Is it? I don't know. She moved to the window beside him, looking out at the kingdom spread below. But I know I can't walk away again, and I know you can't let me, so we're stuck figuring this out whether we want to or not. Iamams. It wasn't a declaration of love, it wasn't forgiveness. It was simply acknowledgement that they were bound together now by violence and consequence, and the mutual understanding that separation would cost more than whatever complications came with staying. Outside, darkness settled over Valamon. Inside Blackthorn Keep, a duke and the woman who made him human stood together facing whatever came next, knowing that every choice from here forward would reshape the kingdom in ways neither could predict or control. And in the dungeons below, 2 members of the Noble Council waited for execution, their fate sealed by the simple fact that they had underestimated exactly how far Duke Cedric Raventhorn would go to protect what was his. The lesson had been delivered. The consequences had been demonstrated. The old rules no longer applied. What came next would be determined by whether love could exist alongside power, or whether one would inevitably consume the other until nothing remained but ruins and regret. The executions were scheduled for dawn. Cedric stood in his study watching the gallows being constructed in the main courtyard, the wood fresh cut and still bleeding sap in the cold morning air. Below, workers moved with grim efficiency, building the platform where Lord Pemberton and Lord Blackwood would hang for treason. The charges had been documented, the evidence compiled. The trial conducted with enough formality to satisfy legal requirements while ensuring the outcome was never in doubt. Justice. Or something that resembled it closely enough to fool most observers. Seraphina had left his chambers an hour before dawn, citing the need for distance from what was about to happen. She hadn't argued against the executions, hadn't pleaded for mercy. She simply couldn't watch, and Cedric understood that watching him order deaths made the reality of what he was impossible to ignore. Love was easier when the violence happened off stage. A knock at the door. Marcus entered without waiting for permission, his face carrying the exhaustion of someone who hadn't slept in 3 days. The prisoners are being prepared. Pemberton is crying. Blackwood is praying. Both maintain they had no knowledge of the abduction. Their knowledge is irrelevant. Cedric turned from the window. They conspired with Mordain. They attempted to pressure me through political maneuvering. Whether they specifically ordered Seraphina's abduction or simply created the conditions that made it possible, the result is the same. They hang. The other council members are terrified. Vexler sent a formal letter pledging absolute loyalty. The remaining lords have requested audience to personally swear fealty. Marcus moved to the desk, dropping a stack of correspondence. Everyone wants to make sure you know they had nothing to do with Mordain. Fear breeds loyalty faster than respect ever did. My father was right about that. Cedric picked up one of the letters, scanning it without interest. Schedule the audience for next week. Make them wait. Let the terror ferment. And the rebuilding. Mordain's territory is yours by conquest. You need to establish governance before someone else moves in. Mopmanets. Install military oversight. Appoint a governor from our officer corps. Someone competent and brutal enough to maintain order without being stupid enough to develop ambitions. He tossed the letter aside. The details don't matter. What matters is everyone seeing that challenging Valamont means extinction. Marcus studied him carefully. You sound like him, your father. The cadence, the casual dismissal of human cost, even the way you're standing right now, that I'm finally learning the lessons he tried to teach me. Kedrick met his friend's eyes without flinching. You were right before. I spent a decade trying to be better than him, smarter, more strategic. And where did it get me? A noble council that thought they could manipulate me. An enemy kingdom that thought they could invade with impunity. Everyone mistaking restraint for weakness. He paused, letting the words settle. That mistake won't be repeated. And Serafina? How does she fit into this new version of you? She doesn't. Not cleanly, but she stays anyway because we're both trapped by what happened. Dean. Kedrick moved to the weapons wall, running his hand along a sword his grandfather had carried. She makes me vulnerable. I make her a target. Neither of us can walk away. So we figure out how to exist in the space between love and liability. That's not sustainable. Nothing is. We survive until we don't. That's all anyone gets. The bells rang across Blackthorn Keep, signaling the hour before execution. Kedrick descended from his study toward the courtyard, Marcus following in silence. Citizens had gathered despite the early hour, drawn by the promise of aristocratic blood and the spectacle of watching their duke demonstrate absolute authority. Guards formed a perimeter, keeping the crowd at safe distance from the gallows. Pemberton and Blackwood were brought out in chains, their fine clothing stripped away, replaced with rough canvas that marked them as condemned. Pemberton was indeed crying, his face blotched red with terror and snot. Blackwood maintained dignity through force of will, his lips moving in silent words that might have been prayer if Kedrick cared to listen closely. He didn't. Their internal states were irrelevant. What mattered was the external message being sent to everyone watching. Kedrick stood on a raised platform across from the gallows, his position ensuring everyone could see both him and the condemned simultaneously. When he spoke, his voice carried across the assembled crowd with practiced authority. Lord Pemberton and Lord Blackwood stand convicted of conspiracy with foreign powers. They coordinated with House Mordaunt to pressure this duchy through political maneuvering that enabled invasion and abduction. Their actions resulted in war. Their choices cost Valamont soldiers their lives. Their collaboration with our enemies cannot be forgiven or forgotten. The sentence is death. Let their fate serve as reminder that treason carries consequences beyond imagination. Pemberton started screaming. Blackwood closed his eyes. The executioner placed nooses around their necks with professional efficiency. The crowd pressed forward, hungry for the moment when gravity and rope would transform living nobles into examples. The trapdoors opened. The rope snapped tight. Pemberton died quickly, his neck breaking with an audible crack. Blackwood strangled slowly, his body convulsing for almost a minute before finally going still. The crowd roared approval. Justice delivered. Order maintained. The Duke protecting his people through violent certainty. Kedrick watched without expression until both bodies stopped moving. Then he descended from the platform and walked back toward the fortress, leaving the corpses swaying in the morning wind as testament to what happened when men forgot who ruled Valamont. Marcus caught up to him in the corridor leading to the Great Hall. That's done. What's next? Next, we consolidate power. I want updated intelligence on every noble house, financial records, trade agreements, personal relationships, anything that could be used as leverage or identifies potential threats. You're planning purges. I'm planning to ensure no one forgets what happens when they move against me. Kedrick entered the Great Hall, the vast space empty except for servants preparing for the day's court sessions. My father ruled through fear alone and died for it. I tried to rule through respect and nearly lost everything. The solution is obvious: rule through fear backed by demonstrated consequences. Make the cost of betrayal so catastrophic that even thinking about it becomes unthinkable. And when everyone hates you, as long as everyone obeys, their feelings are irrelevant. The day proceeded with mechanical efficiency. Court sessions where minor nobles pledged loyalty with transparent terror. Trade discussions where merchants agreed to terms favorable to the duchy without negotiation. Reports from military's commanders confirming that Mordain's territory was being absorbed into Valamont's administrative structure. Everything functioning exactly as it should when absolute power operated without restraint. By late afternoon, Caedric felt the exhaustion of constant vigilance settling into his bones. He dismissed the remaining petitioners and retreated to his private chambers, craving silence and the temporary illusion that he could stop calculating threats long enough to rest. Serafina was waiting in his study. She sat in the chair by the fireplace, her posture suggesting she had been there for hours. When she looked up, her expression carried something he couldn't immediately identify. Not anger, not fear, something colder. They're dead. Not a question. Yes. You watched. I ordered it. Watching was simply acknowledgement of responsibility. Caedric moved to pour wine, his hands steady despite the strange tension in the room. Did you come here to judge me for it? No, I came to tell you something I should have mentioned days ago. She stood slowly, her movements precise. When they took me, when Mordain's men forced me to write that letter, I heard them talking about who ordered the abduction, about who coordinated with them from inside Valamon. Caedric's hand stilled on the wine bottle. You already knew it was Pemberton and Blackwood. That's why I executed them. It wasn't them. Her voice remained perfectly level. They were involved in the political maneuvering, the pressure campaign. But the actual abduction, the coordination with Mordain's invasion, that came from someone closer. Someone you trust completely. Someone who had access to information about when I would be vulnerable and where I would be. The room became very quiet. Outside, evening sounds of the fortress continued. Inside, Caedric felt something fundamental shift beneath his understanding of reality. Who? Marcus Vallon. The name hung in the air like poison. Caedric set down the wine bottle carefully, his mind racing through implications and possibilities and the desperate need for this to be wrong. Marcus, his oldest friend, the man who had stood beside him through every crisis, who had questioned his decisions not from betrayal but from loyalty, who had access to everything and everyone in Blackthorn Keep. That's impossible. I heard his name multiple times. They discussed payment he had already received. They mentioned future considerations once Mordain controlled the Western Territories. They laughed about how completely you trusted him, how easy it had been to manipulate your response. Marty, yeah. Serafina's eyes held something like pity. He's been working with your enemies for months, maybe longer. Everything that happened was designed to destabilize your rule and make you exactly what you've become. A tyrant everyone fears and no one respects. Go on, Paulsen. You're lying. The words came out automatic, defensive. You're manipulating me, turning me against the one person who questioned every decision you made after we met, who pushed you toward violence when diplomacy might have worked, who convinced you to commit all your forces to Mordain when it left Valamont vulnerable. She moved closer, her voice dropping. Think, Caedric. Who benefited from you becoming your father? Who gains when you're isolated and paranoid and ruling through fear alone? His mind spun through memories and conversations. Marcus arguing against bringing Serafina to the fortress. Marcus pushing for aggressive military response. Marcus questioning his judgment at every turn while simultaneously encouraging the exact decisions that led to catastrophe. But that could have been friendship, could have been honest disagreement, could have been. Where's your proof? Yesik. In his chambers, letters from Mordain, payment records, everything documented because he never thought you'd look. Why would you? He's your oldest friend, your most trusted advisor, the man who knows every secret and weakness. She pulled a folded parchment from her cloak. One of Mordain's soldiers gave me this before you burned Ravencross. He thought I might be able to use it to negotiate. I kept it hidden until I was sure. Caedric took the letter with hands that had started to shake. He recognized the seal immediately. House Vallon, Marcus's family crest. The contents were damning. Detailed coordination between Marcus and Mordain's military commanders. Discussion of payment structures. Plans for what would happen after Valamont's forces were depleted fighting a war that Marcus himself had encouraged. The betrayal was comprehensive, systematic, perfect, and completely plausible in ways that made Kaedric's chest tighten with something beyond rage. This was the nightmare scenario every ruler feared. The trusted advisor who wore friendship like a mask while selling information to enemies. The companion who knew every weakness because you had shared them without reservation. The brother in everything but blood who had decided your destruction was worth whatever reward he had been promised. When? His voice came out hoarse. When did you know for certain? Yesterday. I spent the night going through his quarters while he was overseeing the prisoner transfers. Found enough evidence to hang him 3 times over. She paused. I didn't tell you immediately because I needed to be absolutely sure, because I knew what it would do to you, and because I wanted to give you time to recover from Mordain before dealing with this. Consider it. The word tasted like ash. Where is he now? Training yard, running drills with the garrison. Kaedric moved toward the door, his mind emptying of everything except the need for confirmation or denial. For Marcus to explain this in a way that made sense. For there to be some alternative interpretation that didn't require confronting the fact that his oldest friend had sold him to enemies for profit and political gain. But as he walked through the fortress corridors, letter clenched in his fist, he knew with cold certainty that there was no alternative explanation. The evidence was too complete, the coordination too perfect. Marcus had betrayed him, had used their friendship as cover while systematically undermining everything Kaedric had built. Had pushed him toward becoming a tyrant because tyrants made easier targets than strategic thinkers. The training yard was busy with soldiers running through combat drills. Marcus stood near the center, correcting stances and calling out timing. He looked exactly as he always had. Competent, loyal, present. The perfect captain of the guard. The ideal friend. The consummate traitor. Kaedric walked directly to him, the soldiers parting automatically. Marcus turned with a smile that died when he saw whatever expression Kaedric was wearing. Your Grace? What's wrong? Kaedric threw the letter at his feet. Explain that. Marcus glanced down. The color drained from his face. For a moment, absolute silence held the training yard. Then Marcus looked up, and something in his expression confirmed everything Seraphina had said. How did you... He stopped himself. It doesn't matter, you know. How long? Kaedric's hand moved to his sword. Around them, soldiers had stopped training, sensing that something fundamental was breaking. How long have you been selling information to my enemies? 3 years. Since your father died. Since you decided to be better than him, and weak leadership made Valamont vulnerable. Marcus's voice carried strange calm, as if relief at finally dropping the pretense outweighed fear of consequences. You were destroying everything he built. Every reform, every mercy, every diplomatic gesture. You made us look soft, made enemies think we could be challenged. Someone needed to correct that trajectory. By conspiring with House Mordain, by arranging for Seraphina's abduction, by pushing me toward war that cost thousands of lives. Kaedric's voice remained level through sheer force of will. Kaedric's, you manipulated me into becoming exactly what you claimed to oppose. Made me the tyrant you said you feared. For what? Money? Power? The promise of position in whatever government replaced mine? For Valamont. Marcus met his eyes without flinching. Your father understood that strength maintains order. Fear prevents challenges. Violence delivered without hesitation keeps enemies at bay. You forgot those lessons. Started believing mercy had a place in governance. Started making decisions based on personal feelings rather than strategic necessity. You were going to get us conquered through weakness disguised as reform. So you decided to force my hand, make me brutal enough to satisfy your vision of proper leadership. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. The Noble Council's pressure campaign, the fire at Seraphina's house, the abduction, all of it designed to push me past breaking point, to transform me into my father, so Valamont would have the ruler you thought it needed. Good guy, but this it. Yes, no hesitation, no apology. And it worked. Look at what you've become, the Duke who destroys entire houses, who executes traitors without trial, who rules through fear so absolute no one dares challenge you. That's the leader Valamont requires. That's the man who keeps us safe. I gave you that. You should be thanking me. Sure. The soldiers surrounding them stood frozen, comprehension dawning that they were witnessing the exposure of treason from the captain they had served under for years. Some hands moved to weapons. Others simply stared in shock. The training yard had become a courtroom where judgment was being delivered in real time. Kedrick drew his sword slowly. You're right about one thing. You did give me this. The violence, the brutality, the complete abandonment of every principle I valued. You manipulated me into becoming a monster because you believed Valamont needed one. And you know what? You might be right. Maybe mercy is weakness. Maybe reform is vulnerability. Maybe my father's way was the only way that works. He moved closer, blade pointed at Marcus's chest. His oldest friend didn't reach for a weapon, just stood there with strange acceptance, as if he had always known this moment would arrive eventually. But here's the problem with your strategy. You created a monster. Now you have to live with the consequences. So kill me. Marcus spread his arms. Execute the traitor. Add another corpse to your collection. Prove that I was right about what you needed to become. Killing you would be mercy. Quick, clean, exactly what you'd want. Kedrick lowered his sword fractionally. No, you're going to stand trial. Public, documented. Every detail of your betrayal exposed for the kingdom to see. You're going to explain to Valamont exactly how you manipulated their duke, how you conspired with enemies, how you orchestrated an invasion that killed thousands. And then you're going to hang slowly while everyone watches the man who claimed to serve Valamont die for destroying it from within. Marcus's composure cracked. Kedrick, please. Your Grace. The correction came out sharp as broken glass. You lost the right to my name when you sold me to Mordain. Guards! Arrest Captain Valan. Charge him with high treason, conspiracy with foreign powers, and orchestrating the abduction of a Valamont citizen. Place him in the lowest dungeon. Ensure he survives long enough to stand trial. Four soldiers moved immediately, seizing Marcus with the efficiency of men following orders despite internal conflict. He didn't resist, just looked at Kedrick with something that might have been regret or calculation or the satisfaction of someone whose plan had succeeded even in failure. You'll understand eventually what I did, why it was necessary. When you're older and wiser and ruling a kingdom that respects strength, because I forced you to demonstrate it. Marcus allowed himself to be chained without struggle. I saved Valamont, even if you can't see it yet. All I see is a traitor who destroyed the one friendship I valued because he thought he knew better than I did how to rule. Kedrick sheathed his sword, the motion final. Take him away. I don't want to look at him anymore. They dragged Marcus toward the dungeons, his footsteps echoing across the suddenly empty training yard. The remaining soldiers dispersed quickly, unwilling to be present for whatever emotional collapse their duke might experience now that he had lost the person he trusted most in the world. Kedrick stood alone in the center of the yard, surrounded by practice weapons and targets, and the physical evidence of military readiness. His mind felt strangely empty, hollowed out. Marcus had been right there. Always. Every conversation, every decision, every moment of doubt or weakness or humanity. And all of it had been performance. Manipulation. A 20-year friendship revealed as cover for systematic betrayal. The rational part of his mind cataloged implications. Marcus knew everything, every defense, every secret passage, every weakness in Blackthorn Keep's security. If he had been feeding information to Mordain, who else had he been working with? What other plots were in motion? How many other people Kedrick trusted were actually enemies wearing familiar faces? The paranoia was instant and comprehensive. Trust had just become a liability he could no longer afford. Every advisor was potentially compromised. Every guard might be selling information. Every noble pledging loyalty could be acting on instructions from enemies who had spent years embedding themselves in Valamont's power structure. His father had died because he trusted no one. Kedrick had nearly lost everything because he trusted too much. The lesson was obvious and horrifying. Trust itself was the vulnerability. Isolation was the only defense. Power exercised alone was power that couldn't be corrupted by collaboration. He was becoming exactly what Marcus had claimed to oppose. And the worst part was knowing that Marcus had planned for exactly this outcome, had understood that exposing the betrayal would push Kedrick even further into paranoid tyranny, had calculated that even in failure, His strategy would succeed by making Valamont's duke into the monster he believed was necessary. Serafina found him an hour later, still standing in the empty training yard while evening shadows stretched across the fortress. She approached carefully, as if dealing with something dangerous that might lash out unpredictably. Marcus is secured. The evidence from his quarters has been catalogued.
General Thorne is assuming temporary command of military operations. She stopped a careful distance away. What do you need?
I need to know who else is lying, who else has been playing friendship while serving enemies, who else I trusted enough to let inside my defenses. His voice came out flat and mechanical. I need to know if anyone in this entire fortress is actually loyal, or if I'm surrounded by actors waiting for the right moment to strike. You're spiraling. That's what he wanted. The exposure was designed to isolate you, to make you paranoid and brutal and alone. She moved closer despite the danger. Don't give him that victory. Then what do I give him? Trust? The thing that just destroyed me? The vulnerability that let my oldest friend sell me piece by piece to enemies? Kedrick finally looked at her, and whatever she saw in his expression made her flinch. You were right before. Power and love can't coexist. Power requires isolation. The moment you let anyone close enough to matter, they become the blade that kills you. That's not... Marcus stood beside me for 20 years. Saved my life multiple times, questioned my decisions because I thought he cared about my well-being rather than manipulating my responses. I trusted him with everything, and he used every piece of that trust to serve my enemies. If I was that wrong about him, I'm wrong about everyone, including you. The accusation hung between them like drawn steel. Serafina's expression shifted from concern to something harder. You think I'm part of this? I think everyone is part of something. That betrayal is the default state, and loyalty is just delayed treachery. That the only person I can trust is myself, and even that's questionable given how thoroughly Marcus played me. He turned away from her, staring at the fortress walls. You should leave Blackthorn Keep. Go somewhere safe. Somewhere my enemies can't use you against me. I'm not leaving. Then you're staying at your own risk. Because I can't protect you, can't trust myself to recognize threats, can't separate genuine loyalty from performance. His hands clenched into fists. Marcus was right about everything. I'm weak, compromised, vulnerable because I tried to be human instead of powerful. That ends now. Kaedric, don't. The word came out sharp enough to cut. Don't try to talk me down or convince me I'm wrong or suggest that love and trust and humanity have places in governance. Marcus just proved they don't. My father knew it. Now I know it. And you're going to learn it too if you stay here watching me become what's necessary. She stood silently for a long moment. Then she spoke with quiet certainty that somehow cut deeper than any argument. When you finish destroying yourself trying to prove Marcus right, I'll still be here. Because someone needs to remember who you were before betrayal turned you into this. And because walking away would mean he wins completely. She left before he could respond, her footsteps fading into the fortress depths. Kedrick remained in the training yard as night fell completely, surrounded by darkness and the crushing weight of understanding that everything he had built was compromised. Every relationship suspect, every loyalty potentially performance, every moment of trust revealed as strategic weakness. The trial would happen within days. He would expose Marcus's betrayal publicly, would execute him in front of the entire kingdom. Would demonstrate that even the closest friend became just another corpse when they moved against Duke Raventhorn. The message would be clear. The fear would be absolute. The isolation would be complete. And he would rule alone, because ruling alone was the only way to prevent betrayal from destroying everything again. 3 days later, Marcus Vallon stood in chains before a tribunal composed of military officers and minor nobles carefully selected for their lack of connection to anyone involved. The Great Hall had been converted into a courtroom, every seat filled with citizens who had come to witness the trial of the man who had served as captain of the guard and betrayed his duke to foreign enemies. The evidence was presented systematically. Letters between Marcus and House Mordain, payment records showing gold transferred to accounts under his control, testimony from captured Mordain officers confirming his role in coordinating the invasion, Documentation proving he had arranged for Seraphina's abduction and used information from inside Blackthorn Keep to undermine Valamont's security. Marcus didn't deny any of it, stood silent while his crimes were catalogued in exhaustive detail. When given opportunity to defend himself, he offered only one statement. Everything I did was for Valamont, to preserve strength when our Duke chose weakness, to maintain order when reform threatened chaos. History will determine whether my methods were justified, but my loyalty to this kingdom was never in question. The tribunal deliberated for less than an hour. The verdict was unanimous. Marcus Vallon was guilty of high treason. The sentence was death by hanging, to be carried out immediately. They erected the gallows in the same courtyard where Pemberton and Blackwood had died days earlier. The crowd was larger this time, drawn by the spectacle of watching someone who had stood at the Duke's right hand for 2 decades become an example of what happened to traitors regardless of past service. Caedric stood on the same platform he had occupied before, watching his oldest friend being led to execution. Marcus walked steadily despite his chains, his head held high, his expression showing neither fear nor regret. When they placed the noose around his neck, he looked directly at Caedric with eyes that held something complicated and unreadable. The executioner waited for the Duke's signal. The crowd fell silent. The moment stretched between life and death, between justice and revenge, between necessary brutality and the final destruction of whatever humanity Caedric had been trying to preserve. He raised his hand. The trapdoor opened. Marcus Vallon fell. The rope caught him hard enough that death should have been instant. But something went wrong. The rope twisted. Marcus's neck didn't break cleanly. He hung there strangling, his body convulsing, his face turning colors as he died slowly and painfully in front of the assembled kingdom. It took almost 2 minutes before he finally went still. The crowd erupted in horrified fascination. The executioner looked panicked, clearly not having intended the slow death. Caedric watched without expression until Marcus's body stopped moving completely. Then he turned and walked back into the fortress, leaving the corpse swaying in the winter wind as testament to what happened when even the most trusted advisor forgot that loyalty to Duke Raventhorn was absolute or fatal. Inside his study, alone with wine and silence and the crushing weight of isolation, Caedric finally allowed himself to feel the full impact of what had just happened. Marcus was dead, his oldest friend, his most trusted advisor. The man who had stood beside him through everything, gone, executed, transformed from companion into cautionary tale. And the worst part was knowing that Marcus had been partially right. The reforms had made Valamont vulnerable. The mercy had invited challenge. The attempt to be better than his father had nearly cost him everything. Maybe brutal isolation really was the only way to maintain power. Maybe trust was just weakness waiting to be exploited. Maybe becoming a monster was the only way to protect the kingdom from other monsters. The door opened. He didn't turn. Didn't need to. Only one person would enter now. Seraphina's voice carried quiet devastation. I watched from the windows. Saw him die. Saw your face while it happened. And what did you see? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Like you'd carved out whatever part of you used to feel anything. She moved into his peripheral vision. Marcus broke you. Not the betrayal itself. The execution. Watching your oldest friend die and feeling nothing. That's what finally killed who you used to be. Good. The word came out empty. That person was weak, vulnerable, easily manipulated. Better to be nothing than to be that. You don't believe that. I believe survival requires sacrifice. I believe power demands isolation. I believe trust is the weakness that destroys rulers who mistake friendship for loyalty. He finally looked at her, and what she saw in his eyes made her step back involuntarily. I believe Marcus was right. Valamont needs a monster, so that's what I'll be. And what about us? The question should have mattered, should have broken through the ice that had settled over everything. Instead, Caedric felt only the cold calculation that had replaced whatever emotions used to complicate his decisions. Us. You and the Duke who destroyed a kingdom to retrieve you, who executed his oldest friend for betraying him, who's becoming exactly the tyrant everyone feared. He poured wine with steady hands. You should leave while you can, before I decide that caring about you is another vulnerability I can't afford. You won't. You're certain, after everything you've watched me become? After seeing me execute Marcus without hesitation? After witnessing exactly how little humanity I have left? He took a drink, the wine tasting like ash. You're betting your life on someone who might not exist anymore. Matwam wam peace. I'm betting it on the fact that if you truly felt nothing, you wouldn't be trying this hard to push me away. She moved closer despite the warning in his posture. You're terrified, not of your enemies, of yourself, of what you had to do and what it cost. So you're trying to isolate completely because isolation means you can't be hurt again. But that's not strength. That's just cowardice wearing power like armor. The words hit harder than any blade. Kadric set down his wine carefully, his control fracturing for the first time since watching Marcus die. He was my friend, my brother, the only person I trusted completely. And he sold me. Piece by piece. Year after year. Used our friendship as cover while destroying everything I tried to build. His voice cracked slightly. If I was that wrong about him, I'm wrong about everything. Wrong about you. Wrong about whether love and power can coexist. Wrong about the entire foundation I built my life on. So you burn it all down and start over as your father's son. Isolated, brutal, feared but never loved. Powerful but always alone. She reached out slowly, her hand stopping just short of touching him. Marcus won, not by betraying you, by making you believe that betrayal was inevitable, that everyone lies, that trust itself is weakness. He turned you into exactly what he claimed Valamont needed, and you're going to spend the rest of your life proving him right. Said. What's the alternative? The question came out raw. Trust again? Open myself to being destroyed piece by the next person who decides manipulation is justified? Let myself be vulnerable when vulnerability is what nearly cost me everything? The alternative is accepting that Marcus was one person, that betrayal doesn't mean everyone betrays, that power without connection is just survival, and surviving isn't the same as living. Her hand finally made contact, resting gently on his arm. You're the Duke. You can't afford weakness, but you're also human, and pretending you're not will destroy you more thoroughly than any conspiracy. Kedrick looked at her hand on his arm. Such a small gesture, such enormous implications. To allow the touch meant accepting vulnerability, meant acknowledging that despite everything, some part of him still wanted connection more than safety, meant choosing humanity over the absolute control that would keep him protected but empty. Marcus had manipulated him into becoming a monster. Serafina was offering him the choice to remain human. Both paths led to destruction eventually. The question was which destruction he could live with. Before he could answer, the door burst open. General Thorne entered without apology, his face carrying urgency that overrode protocol. Your Grace, we have a situation. The Western garrison just reported military movement. Multiple kingdoms. Coordinated advance toward our borders from 3 directions simultaneously. Everything stopped. Kadrick's mind shifted instantly from philosophical crisis to tactical assessment. How many? Preliminary estimates suggest 50,000 combined forces. They're calling themselves the Alliance for Regional Stability, claiming they're intervening to prevent Valamont's aggressive expansion from destabilizing the entire region. Thorne spread a map on the desk. They're using Mordaine's destruction as justification, saying you've become a threat that requires collective response. They're using my victory as pretext for invasion. Kedrick studied the map, his mind racing through defensive options. Marcus's betrayal wasn't just about Mordaine. He was feeding information to multiple kingdoms, building a coalition. The entire conspiracy was designed to either destroy me through internal collapse or provoke external intervention. And it worked. Thorne's expression was grim. They think you're weakened by recent conflicts. Think your forces are depleted from the Mordaine campaign. Think this is the perfect moment to strike while you're isolated and vulnerable. They're partially right. Kadrick calculated numbers and odds with cold precision. We're at maybe 60% strength, extended supply lines, morale complicated by recent executions. Half the noble houses terrified to support me, the perfect target for coordinated assault. So we negotiate, buy time to rebuild forces, and no. The word came out flat and absolute. Negotiation means weakness. Means every kingdom within 1,000 miles thinks they can pressure Valemount through military threat. We fight, win or lose, but we fight. Your Grace, the odds are irrelevant. Valemount doesn't surrender, doesn't beg, doesn't accept terms dictated by enemies who think collective cowardice outweighs individual strength. He looked up from the map, his expression carrying the cold certainty of someone who had moved past calculation into pure will. Mobilize everything, every soldier, every reserve, every citizen who can hold a weapon. We're going to demonstrate why attacking Valemount requires more than numbers and good intentions. General Thorne nodded and departed, leaving Caedric alone with Seraphina and the map showing 3 armies converging on his kingdom like the jaws of a trap decades in the making. Marcus's final betrayal revealed in full scope. Not just selling information to one enemy, but coordinating a regional coalition designed to overwhelm Valemount through collective force. Caedric had become his father's son, had executed traitors and destroyed enemies and ruled through fear absolute. And it hadn't been enough. The isolation hadn't protected him. The brutality hadn't prevented attack. The transformation into a monster had simply made him a more attractive target for kingdoms that feared what he represented. Marcus had been right and wrong simultaneously. Valemount needed strength. But the kind of strength Caedric had embraced only invited larger enemies to coordinate their response. He had won battles while losing the strategic position, had demonstrated power while undermining the foundations that made power sustainable. And now 3 armies were coming to finish what Marcus had started, to prove that tyrants eventually fall regardless of how absolute their control appears. To demonstrate that isolation and fear and systematic brutality were just slow suicide wearing the mask of strength. Seraphina stood beside him, looking at the map with an expression that mixed understanding and sorrow. This is the moment, isn't it? Where everything we've done leads to either extinction or transformation. Transformation isn't an option. We don't have time to rebuild alliances or reform governance or convince anyone that I'm something other than what I've become. Caedric traced the invasion routes with his finger. We have maybe 2 weeks before they're at our borders. After that, it's just war until one side breaks completely. So you're choosing to fight as you are, the isolated tyrant against the coordinated response, the monster versus the world that decided monsters need to be put down. I'm choosing to protect Valemount the only way I know how, through violence delivered with enough intensity that even victory costs our enemies more than they're willing to pay. He looked at her directly. And you need to leave, now, before this fortress becomes a tomb. We've had this conversation already. That was before 3 armies decided to erase Valemount from the map, before the endgame started, before I stopped having any illusions about survival. His voice carried finality. You leave. You survive. You remember that I tried to be something other than this before Marcus in reality taught me better. That's the only legacy worth preserving. No. The single word held absolute certainty. I stay. We fight. And if Valemount falls, it falls with both of us on the walls. Because that's what love means when everything else is burning. Caedric wanted to argue, wanted to force her away from the destruction that was coming, wanted to preserve something from the wreckage of whatever they had been building together. But looking at her expression, he understood that she had made the same calculation he had. Some choices transcended survival. Some stands mattered regardless of outcome. Some people stayed despite knowing exactly how badly everything was going to end. Outside the study windows, Blackthorn Keep prepared for war. Soldiers assembled. Weapons were distributed. Citizens who had never expected to fight began training for the defense of a kingdom ruled by a duke who had become exactly what his enemies claimed. A tyrant willing to burn everything rather than bend. Marcus Valen's corpse still hung in the courtyard, a reminder of what happened to traitors. Soon it would be surrounded by thousands more bodies as 3 kingdoms tried to prove that collective force could overwhelm individual brutality. That tyrants eventually fell. That the monster Duke Raventhorn had become was just another problem waiting to be solved through superior numbers and coordinated strategy. They were probably right. The odds were catastrophic, the strategic position impossible. The outcome almost certainly defeat and death and the complete destruction of everything Valamont had been. But Caedric Raventhorn had stopped caring about odds somewhere between executing his oldest friend and watching invasion plans materialize from betrayal's final gift. He would fight because fighting was all that remained, would defend because defense was the only choice left, would demonstrate that even dying, Valamont's Duke was more dangerous than three kingdoms had calculated. And beside him, refusing every opportunity to escape, Seraphina Vale would stand witness to whether love could exist alongside power, or whether both would burn together in the flames of everything Marcus had orchestrated. The message was sent within the hour. Duke Caedric Raventhorn received notice of the Alliance for Regional Stability's demands with appropriate contempt. Valamont would not surrender territory, would not submit to external governance, would not bend knee to collective cowardice disguised as diplomatic intervention. War was coming, comprehensive, brutal, likely fatal. And for the first time since Marcus's betrayal had shattered every foundation of trust, Caedric felt something other than empty rage. The cold clarity of someone who had finally stopped trying to be anything except exactly what the situation demanded. A monster fighting monsters until nothing remained but ruins, and the question of whether humanity had ever really mattered at all. The War Council convened at midnight in the great hall where Caedric's father had once planned campaigns that left kingdoms burning. Now the son stood where the father had stood, surrounded by maps marking three separate invasion routes converging on Valamont like the fingers of a closing fist. General Thorn, Commander Valens, and a dozen other officers waited in silence that felt heavier than iron. Caedric traced the enemy positions with methodical precision. 50,000 soldiers advancing from three directions simultaneously. The northern force comprised 20,000 troops from the Kingdom of Ashfeld, known for their heavy cavalry and siege warfare. The Eastern Army brought 15,000 from the Confederation of Merchant States, professional soldiers paid in gold and motivated by profit rather than loyalty. The Southern advance carried another 15,000 from the coastal principalities, naval powers who had landed ground forces specifically for this coordinated assault. 3 armies, 3 strategies. One objective: destroy Valamont before Duke Raventhorn could consolidate the power he had demonstrated by annihilating House Mordain. The mathematics were brutal. Valamont could field maybe 30,000 combat-ready troops after recent losses. Defending against coordinated assault from multiple directions meant dividing forces, which meant being outnumbered at every engagement point. Standard defensive doctrine suggested falling back to Blackthorn Keep, weathering siege conditions, and hoping the alliance fractured before starvation forced surrender. That strategy might work if they had months. They had weeks at best. General Thorn spoke first, his voice carrying the weight of someone delivering news no commander wanted to hear. Your Grace, the strategic assessment is grim. We can't defend 3 fronts simultaneously with our current strength. If we concentrate forces against one army, the other 2 overrun undefended territory. If we spread thin trying to cover everything, we're too weak at each point to mount effective resistance. Commander Valens added his analysis with professional detachment that barely concealed underlying fear. The Alliance coordinated this specifically to exploit our weakness. They know we're depleted from Mordain, know our noble houses are fractured and unreliable, know that recent executions have created internal instability. This is textbook overwhelming force applied when the target is most vulnerable. Caedric absorbed the tactical realities without visible reaction. Around him, the officers waited for some brilliant strategy that would transform impossible odds into manageable challenge. He had built a reputation for strategic thinking that exceeded conventional wisdom, for seeing angles others missed, for turning apparent weakness into devastating advantage through preparation and calculated violence. But standing there looking at maps that showed his kingdom being methodically dismantled, Caedric understood something fundamental about warfare that his father had known instinctively. Sometimes there were no clever strategies. Sometimes survival came down to raw will, delivered through violence, so intense it broke the enemy's capacity to continue. Sometimes you won not through brilliance, but through making victory cost more than defeat. His father had called it the doctrine of unacceptable casualties. Make every inch of ground cost so much blood that advancing became psychologically impossible. Transform tactical retreat into strategic horror by ensuring the enemy paid catastrophic prices for marginal gains. Fight not to win territory, but to destroy the enemy's willingness to continue fighting. It was brutal, inefficient, likely suicidal for the defending force, and it was the only option left when conventional strategy offered nothing but slow extinction. Cedric looked up from the maps, meeting the eyes of every officer present. What they saw in his expression made several of them unconsciously step back. "We're not defending three fronts. We're attacking one with everything we have." His voice carried absolute certainty that demanded acceptance rather than agreement. "The northern force from Ashfeld is the strongest and most dangerous. Heavy cavalry, experienced commanders, psychological advantage from believing they're the main assault. We hit them with our entire military before they're fully positioned, destroy them so completely that the other two armies lose the will to continue." General Thorne's professional composure cracked. "Your Grace, that leaves the eastern and southern borders completely undefended. Those armies will have free access to empty territory that I don't care about defending. Let them march through farmland and villages. Let them burn buildings and occupy ground. None of it matters if we destroy Ashfeld's army so decisively that continuing the campaign becomes political suicide for the remaining alliance members." Cedric's finger stabbed the northern position on the map. "This is where the war ends. Win or lose, everything else is just noise." "And the civilians in the eastern and southern territories?" Commander Valen's question carried quiet horror. "We're abandoning thousands of people to enemy occupation. We're sacrificing pieces to win the game. That's what command means. Making choices where every option costs lives, and the only question is which losses serve victory." Cedric's voice remained level despite the brutal calculus. "Evacuate who we can. Burn supplies that might sustain enemy forces. Make the occupied territory as useless as possible. Then we focus every resource on destroying Ashfeld before the other armies realize they're being used as bait." The officers exchanged glances. This was beyond aggressive strategy into something that resembled suicide dressed as tactics. Concentrating all forces meant risking complete destruction in a single engagement. If the assault failed, Valamont would have nothing left for secondary defense. The kingdom would fall in days rather than weeks. But looking at their duke's expression, they understood that conventional defense meant slow death anyway. At least Cedric's strategy offered the possibility of turning catastrophic odds into legendary victory through sheer violent audacity. At least this way they died attacking rather than cowering behind walls waiting for starvation. General Thorne straightened his shoulders, decades of military discipline overriding tactical skepticism. "When do we march?" "Dawn. I want the army moving north before the sun clears the mountains. Fast march. Minimal supplies. We hit Ashfeld's force while they're still establishing camp." Cedric began marking routes on the map with swift precision. Light cavalry scouts ahead to confirm positions. Infantry in rapid deployment formation. Artillery positioned for immediate engagement. We don't negotiate. Don't demand surrender. Don't give them time to organize proper defense. We just hit them like a hammer until something breaks. "Your Grace," Commander Valens hesitated, choosing words carefully. "This strategy relies on our troops maintaining cohesion and morale through what will be the most brutal engagement most of them have ever experienced. After recent events, after the executions, after Marcus's betrayal became public knowledge, can we count on that kind of unified commitment?" The question hung in the air like accusation and genuine concern combined. Cedric had spent the past weeks transforming from reformist leader into feared tyrant, had executed nobles and former friends with systematic brutality, had demonstrated that mercy was weakness and compassion was vulnerability. The troops knew exactly what kind of man commanded them now, one who valued victory over humanity and power over connection. That reputation would either inspire absolute obedience or collapse into mutiny under pressure. There was no middle ground left. Cedric met Valen's eyes without flinching. "The troops will follow because they understand that I'll die on that battlefield before I surrender. Because they know that retreat means annihilation and victory means survival. Because every soldier in this army has seen what happens when Duke Raventhorn gets challenged and wants to ensure they're on the winning side." He paused, letting the words settle. "Fear breeds loyalty faster than love ever did. My father taught me that. Marcus proved it. And tomorrow will demonstrate it works even when the odds are catastrophic." The council ended with grim efficiency. Officers dispersed to prepare their units for forced march and immediate combat. Within the fortress, the machinery of military mobilization began its mechanical process. Weapons distributed, armor checked, supplies loaded onto wagons designed for speed rather than capacity. Everything calibrated for the doctrine of absolute commitment. Win the northern engagement or die trying. Ceadric remained in the Great Hall after everyone departed, standing alone with maps that showed his kingdom being systematically invaded. The rational part of his mind catalogued all the ways this strategy could fail catastrophically. The eastern and southern armies could coordinate faster than anticipated. Ashfeld's force could be stronger or better positioned than intelligence suggested. His own troops could break under pressure. Any of 1,000 variables could transform aggressive assault into complete massacre. But beneath the rational analysis, something darker whispered that failure didn't matter as much as the attempt. That dying while attacking was preferable to surviving through compromise. That the legacy of Duke Ceadric Raventhorn would be measured not by how long he lasted, but by how fiercely he fought when everything collapsed. His father had died poisoned by someone close. Ceadric would die on a battlefield surrounded by enemies if that's what fate demanded. At least that death had dignity. The thought was poison, nihilistic, exactly the mindset that turned commanders into casualties. But he couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus's final betrayal had broken something fundamental in his capacity to imagine futures beyond violence. The man who had tried to reform Valamont was dead. The Duke who remained cared only about demonstrating that challenging him carried consequences even when the challenger won. Footsteps behind him, light, deliberate. He didn't need to turn to know who approached. Seraphina's voice carried exhaustion mixed with determination. I heard the strategy. You're attacking with everything, abandoning the other territories completely. Bas, buas boshachemeni. Yes. That's not strategy. That's just gambling everything on one engagement because you've stopped caring whether you survive. She moved beside him, looking at the same maps. This is what Marcus wanted. You becoming so brutal and isolated that self-destruction starts looking like strength. Marcus is dead. What he wanted stopped mattering when the rope broke his neck. Ceadric's hands remained flat on the table. I'm doing what the situation requires. Concentrating force against the strongest enemy while accepting losses everywhere else. Standard military doctrine when defending against superior numbers. Standard doctrine includes planning for what happens after the battle, planning for governance and reconstruction, and maintaining order. She turned to face him directly. You're not planning for after, you're planning for a final stand that ends with either legendary victory or glorious death. Both options require not thinking past tomorrow. Tomorrow is all that matters. Survive the northern engagement, and we deal with whatever comes next. Fail, and there is no next. He finally looked at her, and what she saw in his eyes made her breath catch. You wanted me to stay human, to not become my father, to preserve some connection between power and compassion. I tried. Marcus destroyed that possibility when he proved trust was just weaponized vulnerability. Now all that's left is the Duke who protects Valamont through violence. That's what tomorrow requires. That's what I'm going to deliver. And what about us? The question came out quieter than she intended. If you survive tomorrow, if this insane strategy actually works, what happens to the man who looked at me like I was worth burning kingdoms for? Ceadric reached out slowly, his hand cupping her face with surprising gentleness considering everything he had become. That man died somewhere between executing Marcus and accepting that 3 armies are coming to finish what betrayal started. What's left is a Duke who values your survival more than his own humanity, who will fight tomorrow knowing that victory means you live and defeat means at least you are here with me at the end. His thumb traced her cheekbone. That's not the romance you deserve, her, but it's the only version I have left to offer. She leaned into his touch despite the horror of what he was describing. You're talking like tomorrow is already decided, like we've already lost, and you're just going through the motions of dying with style. Maybe, or maybe I'm accepting that some battles can't be won through strategy alone. Sometimes you just have to walk into the nightmare and keep swinging until something breaks. Sometimes the only way through is forward, even when forward leads to destruction.
He pulled her closer, his forehead resting against hers. I need you to promise me something. What?
If tomorrow goes wrong, if the army breaks or the strategy fails or I fall on that battlefield, I need you to run. Take whatever horse is fastest and ride until you're somewhere I can't follow because I'm dead. Don't stay to witness the end. Don't let my enemies use you for leverage or entertainment. Just survive and remember that I tried. I won't promise that. Serafina shuts.
No.
She pulled back enough to meet his eyes directly. You don't get to plan my escape from your failure. You don't get to die heroically while I run away safe. If tomorrow is the end, we face it together. If Valamont falls, it falls with both of us on the walls. That's what I chose when I decided to stay. The stubborn certainty in her voice should have terrified him, should have made him lock her away somewhere safe against her will, should have triggered every protective instinct that remained beneath the brutality. Instead, Kedrick felt something crack in his chest that might have been relief or gratitude, or the recognition that dying beside someone who chose to stay was better than surviving alone. He kissed her then. Not gentle, not romantic, desperate and fierce, and tasting like goodbye disguised as promise. She responded with equal intensity, her hands gripping his armor hard enough to leave marks, her body pressed against his as if proximity could prevent the separation that tomorrow threatened. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, the map still showed 3 armies converging. The strategy still relied on impossible odds and brutal sacrifice. The outcome still balanced on the edge between legendary victory and complete annihilation. But for a moment, in the darkness of the Great Hall where his father had planned campaigns built on fear alone, Kedrick felt something other than empty rage. The knowledge that whatever happened tomorrow, at least he wouldn't face it completely alone. Dawn came cold and gray, the sun hidden behind clouds that promised snow before nightfall. In the courtyard, 30,000 soldiers assembled in formation, their breath creating fog that rose like spirits of the already dead. Kedrick walked among them in full armor, his father's sword at his hip, his presence radiating the kind of controlled violence that made men straighten unconsciously when he passed. He had learned from watching his father address troops before major campaigns. The old duke had delivered speeches designed to inspire fear rather than courage, had threatened punishment for failure more than promising reward for victory, had made it clear that death in battle was preferable to survival through cowardice. The approach had worked because the troops understood their duke was more dangerous than any enemy. Kedrick climbed the platform overlooking the assembled army. The silence was absolute. 30,000 men waiting for words that would either inspire commitment or confirm suspicions that their duke was leading them to pointless slaughter. He didn't offer comfort, didn't promise easy victory, didn't pretend the odds were anything other than catastrophic. Instead, he gave them the truth delivered with enough conviction to make truth sound like strategy. 3 armies think they can destroy Valamont through coordinated force. They believe we're weak, depleted, vulnerable. They think recent events have fractured our unity and made us easy targets. His voice carried across the courtyard without effort. They're right about our numbers. We're outnumbered almost 2 to 1. They're right about our position. We've lost strategic advantage through recent conflicts. They're right that conventional defense means slow death. Pisons. The army absorbed this with visible tension. Officers shifted nervously. Soldiers exchanged glances. This wasn't the speech they expected. But they're wrong about what makes Valamont dangerous. We're not powerful because we have the most soldiers or the best positions or the smartest strategies. We're powerful because we're willing to pay costs that other kingdoms find unacceptable. Because we fight not just to win, but to make our enemies regret they ever raised weapons against us. Because Duke Raventhorn doesn't negotiate and doesn't retreat and doesn't accept any outcome except absolute victory or glorious death. He paused, letting the words sink in. Around the courtyard, postures began to straighten. Fear transformed into something harder. Today we march north. We hit Ashfeld's army with everything we have. We don't defend, don't establish siege positions, don't give them time to organize resistance. We just attack with violence so intense they break before we do. Some of you will die. Many of you will die. But the ones who survive will be able to say they stood with Valamont when 3 kingdoms tried to erase us from existence. Will be able to tell their children they fought beside the Duke who refused to bend even when the entire world pushed.
The army erupted in response. Not cheers, something darker and more primal. The roar of men who had been given permission to become monsters in service of survival. The sound of collective fury being weaponized and aimed at enemies who had made the fatal mistake of thinking Valamont could be conquered through superior numbers. Caedric descended from the platform, mounted his horse, and rode to the front of the formation. Behind him, the army organized itself with brutal efficiency. Cavalry flanking, infantry in rapid assault formation, artillery crews ready to deploy at first engagement. Everything calibrated for the doctrine of overwhelming violence applied without hesitation or mercy. They marched north as the sun finally broke through clouds, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of red that felt prophetic. Seraphina rode beside Caedric despite his protests, her presence a constant reminder of what survived beyond strategy and violence. General Thorn commanded the vanguard. Commander Valens managed the supply lines. The entire military machine moved with coordinated purpose toward a battle that would determine whether Valamont survived or became another cautionary tale about tyrants who overreached. The forced march took 2 days. Scouts returned with updated intelligence. Ashfeld's army had established camp in a valley position that offered defensive advantages but limited mobility. 20,000 troops organized in standard siege formation, clearly expecting Valamont's forces to defend their borders rather than attack into enemy-held territory. Artillery positioned for bombardment, cavalry ready for flanking maneuvers. Infantry dug into positions designed to withstand prolonged assault. Perfect defensive setup. Completely wrong strategy. Caedric studied the scout reports from a hilltop overlooking the valley. Beside him, General Thorn outlined tactical options with professional detachment. They're positioned for siege warfare, expecting us to defend Blackthorn Keep while they systematically reduce our territory. They have numerical advantage and terrain benefit. Direct assault will cost thousands of casualties before we even breach their perimeters. Then we attack before they realize we're here. Night assault. No artillery bombardment to warn them. Just cavalry and infantry hitting their camp while they're sleeping or unprepared. Caedric traced attack routes with his finger. Speed and violence. We're inside their perimeter before they can establish defensive formations. Turn their numerical advantage into chaos by making organization impossible. That's suicide for the vanguard. First waves will be slaughtered before the main force can exploit the breach. Thorn's voice carried quiet resignation. Thorn's voice carried quiet. You're asking thousands of men to die just creating the opportunity for the rest to attack. Yes, and they'll do it because they understand that's what victory costs when you're outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Caedric looked at his general directly. I'll lead the vanguard personally. If I'm asking men to die opening the path, they deserve to see their duke die beside them, if it comes to that. Your Grace, if you fall in the initial assault, then you continue the attack until either we win or everyone's dead. Those are the orders. No retreat. No negotiation. Just violence until one side breaks completely. He turned from the hilltop toward where his army waited. Prepare the troops. We attack at midnight. Anyone who wants to pray or write letters or make peace with mortality has 6 hours. After that, we're committed. The afternoon passed with the strange calm that preceded major battles. Soldiers checked weapons and armor with methodical precision. Officers reviewed attack formations. Cavalry units prepared for the rapid deployment that would turn night into massacre. Everything moving toward the moment when calculation ended and violence began. Caedric found Seraphina near the medical tents, helping prepare supplies for the inevitable casualties. She looked up as he approached, her hands stained with something that might have been medicinal tincture or blood from preliminary injuries. You're leading the vanguard. Not a question. Yes. That's the suicide position. First into enemy lines. Highest casualty rate. The position commanders send troops they can afford to lose. She stood slowly. She eased, wiping her hands on a cloth that did nothing to remove the stains. You're not troops that can be afforded. You're the Duke. The strategic center, the thing this entire army depends on for direction. I'm also the symbol they follow. If I hide while ordering them to die, I'm just another aristocrat sending peasants to fight my battles. If I lead from the front, I'm the Duke who bleeds beside his people. Caedric's voice carried finality. This is the only way they fight with the intensity we need.
They have to believe I value victory more than survival. Have to see me risk everything I'm asking them to risk. So you're gambling your life to inspire morale. Serafina moved closer, her voice dropping. What happens when you die in the first minutes? When the vanguard gets slaughtered and the troops see their duke fall? Does that inspire them to fight harder or break completely? Boss. Then I die knowing I tried. That I didn't hide behind walls while Valamont burned. That I faced the end the same way I faced everything else. Head on and refusing to bend. He reached out, taking her stained hands in his. I need you to stay here, with the medical units, away from the front lines. If I fall, if everything collapses, you run. Take whatever horse is fastest and ride until... We've had this conversation. The answer hasn't changed. Her grip tightened. I stay. I see this through. And if you die on that battlefield, at least you die knowing someone chose you over survival. The stubborn certainty in her voice should have made him angry, should have triggered every protective instinct. Instead, Kaedric felt only gratitude mixed with the soul-deep exhaustion of someone who had stopped fighting inevitable outcomes. He pulled her close, holding her with desperate intensity, while around them the army prepared for battle. This might be the last moment of peace before everything dissolved into chaos and screaming and the brutal arithmetic of violence. This might be the final memory worth preserving before death, or victory transformed everything into something unrecognizable. When they finally separated, the sun was setting behind mountains that framed the valley like the walls of an arena. Soon darkness would cover everything. Soon 30,000 Valamont soldiers would descend on an enemy camp, expecting siege warfare rather than midnight slaughter. Soon Kaedric would discover whether his father's doctrine of unacceptable casualties worked when applied to impossible odds. Soon. But for this moment, standing with Serafina while sunset painted everything in shades of blood and gold, Kaedric allowed himself to imagine alternatives that would never exist. Futures where Marcus hadn't betrayed him, where reform had succeeded, where power and humanity coexisted without one consuming the other, where the man who loved her wasn't the same man who had become a monster to protect her. But imagination didn't change reality. The battle was coming. The odds were catastrophic. The outcome balanced on edges sharper than any blade. Midnight arrived with absolute darkness, clouds covering moon and stars, rendering the valley nearly invisible except where enemy campfires marked Ashfeld's position. Kaedric sat on his horse at the front of the vanguard, 5,000 cavalry, ready to charge into the enemy camp with violence designed to create chaos rather than tactical advantage. Behind them, the main infantry force waited for the signal that perimeter defenses had collapsed and direct assault could commence. General Thorne rode up beside him, his expression showing the grim acceptance of someone who understood they were likely living the final hours of their lives. The troops are ready, Your Grace. Cavalry in assault formation. Infantry prepared for immediate advance once the breach is confirmed. Medical units positioned for casualty management. He paused. Your father would have been proud. This is exactly the kind of brutal aggression he built his reputation on. My father died because he never learned the difference between inspiring fear and earning loyalty. He ruled through systematic brutality that made everyone an enemy. I tried to be different, smarter, better. Kaedric's voice carried bitter recognition. Turns out he was right all along. Fear works. Loyalty is weakness. And the only way to maintain power is accepting that everyone will eventually betray or abandon you. No, not everyone. Thorne gestured toward where Serafina waited with the medical units, her silver cloak visible even in darkness. Some people stay despite having every reason to run. That's worth remembering when everything else feels like betrayal. Before Kaedric could respond, a scout galloped up from the direction of the enemy camp. Your Grace, movement in the valley. Ashfeld's army is repositioning. Looks like they received intelligence about our presence. They're organizing defensive perimeters and preparing for assault. Everything stopped. The entire strategy had relied on surprise, on hitting them while they were unprepared and disorganized. If they knew Valamont's forces were approaching, if they had time to establish proper defensive formations, the night assault transformed from aggressive gamble into outright suicide. Kaedric's mind raced through implications and alternatives. Someone had warned Ashfeld, either a spy in his own ranks or scouts that hadn't been intercepted. Either way, The tactical advantage had evaporated. Attacking now meant charging into prepared defenses with numerical inferiority. Retreating meant abandoning the only strategy that offered any chance of survival. The choice was immediate and absolute: die attacking or die fleeing. At least attacking preserves some dignity. We proceed as planned. They know we're here. They don't know we're insane enough to charge directly into their prepared positions. His voice carried across the assembled cavalry. His voice? Speed and violence. We hit them so hard they don't have time to think about numerical advantages. We break through their lines or die trying. No middle ground, no retreat. Just forward until something gives. The cavalry absorbed this with the grim understanding of soldiers who recognized suicide orders and chose obedience over survival. Behind Kaedric, 5,000 riders prepared to charge into darkness toward an enemy that was ready and waiting and superior in every tactical metric. This was the moment, the point where calculation ended and will began, where strategy dissolved into pure violent commitment, where Duke Kaedric Ravensthorn either proved that his father's doctrine worked against impossible odds, or demonstrated that brutality without wisdom was just expensive suicide. He raised his sword. The blade caught firelight from distant enemy camp, creating a beacon visible across the assembled cavalry. For a moment, absolute silence held the night. Then Kaedric lowered the blade, pointing directly at the valley below. The cavalry surged forward like a wave of steel and fury, their hoofbeats creating thunder that rolled across the landscape. Kaedric rode at the absolute front, his position making him the first target for every arrow and blade that waited in the darkness ahead. Behind him, 5,000 riders followed their duke into the nightmare, committed to either legendary victory or death that would be remembered for generations. The distance to the enemy camp collapsed in seconds. Arrows began falling from darkness, finding targets with horrible efficiency. Horses screamed, men fell. The charge continued without slowing, momentum carrying them forward even as casualties mounted. Kaedric felt an arrow graze his shoulder, the impact barely registering through armor and adrenaline. Another struck his horse, the animal stumbling but somehow maintaining pace. Then they hit the enemy perimeter. The collision was catastrophic. Defensive pikes stopped the first wave completely. Riders impaled on weapons designed specifically to counter cavalry charges. The second wave crashed into the wreckage, adding to the chaos. The third wave, where Kaedric rode, found gaps in the defensive line created by earlier casualties and punched through into the camp interior. Suddenly, they were inside, surrounded by enemy soldiers scrambling to respond. The organized defense collapsed into individual combats scattered across the camp. Kaedric's sword found flesh repeatedly, his movements mechanical and efficient, his mind emptied of everything except the immediate violence required for survival. Around him, Valamont cavalry spread chaos, attacking with the desperate intensity of men who knew they couldn't retreat and might not survive. The main infantry assault hit the perimeter seconds later. 30,000 troops slamming into defensive positions, weakened by the cavalry breach. The battle transformed from organized warfare into comprehensive slaughter. Ashfeld's numerical advantage meant nothing when organization became impossible. Their defensive positions offered no protection when the enemy was already inside their camp. Their superior tactics failed when confronted with violence, delivered without any concern for tactical preservation. Kaedric fought his way deeper into the enemy camp, his cavalry forming a wedge that drove toward where Ashfeld's command tent stood. Leadership. That's where battles were won or lost. Kill the commanders and the army became a mob. Kill the decision-makers and numerical advantage transformed into collective panic. He broke through another defensive line, his horse finally collapsing from accumulated wounds. He continued on foot, surrounded by soldiers who fought beside their duke with fanatical commitment. Arrows and blades came from every direction. Men died screaming. The ground became slick with blood, and worse. The night dissolved into the kind of violence that turned humans into mechanisms designed purely for killing. Then he saw the command tent, saw Ashfeld's generals scrambling to maintain control of an army that was disintegrating into chaos, saw the exact target that justified every sacrifice that brought them to this moment. Kaedric charged. His remaining cavalry followed. The tent's defenders tried to mount resistance, but couldn't stop the momentum of men who had already accepted death and were operating on pure, violent will. He cut down the first officer, then the second. His blade found the general's throat, ending whatever orders he was shouting, silencing the voice that had coordinated this invasion. The command structure collapsed. Without leadership, without clear orders, Ashfeld's army began to fracture. Units retreated. Others surrendered. The disciplined assault force transformed into scattered groups fighting for survival rather than victory. And everywhere, Valamont's soldiers pressed advantage with the kind of merciless efficiency that turned battles into massacres. Dawn broke over a valley painted entirely in red. 20,000 Ashfeld soldiers had entered this battle. Maybe 5,000 remained alive by the time the sun revealed the full scope of devastation. Valamont's casualties were horrific. 8,000 dead, 3,000 wounded seriously enough to be combat ineffective. But they had won, against superior numbers, against prepared defenses, against all tactical logic. They had won through sheer violent commitment that made victory cost less than defeat would have. Kadric stood in the center of the ruined camp, his armor dented and blood-stained, his sword notched from repeated impacts with bone and steel. Around him, Valamont's soldiers secured prisoners and tended to wounded and tried to process the fact that they had survived what should have been mutual annihilation. General Thorn approached, his left arm bound where an arrow had found gap in his armor. "Your Grace, the battle is ours. Ashfeld's army is destroyed. Prisoners report the eastern and southern forces received word of this engagement and are withdrawing. The alliance is broken." The word should have brought relief, should have triggered something resembling triumph. Instead, Kadric felt only the crushing exhaustion of someone who had gambled everything and won, without understanding what victory actually meant. Casualty reports? 35% killed. Another 15% wounded seriously enough to be combat ineffective. We can field maybe 15,000 troops if another engagement becomes necessary. Thorn's voice carried the hollow tone of someone calculating human costs. We destroyed them, but we destroyed ourselves in the process. Then we destroyed them enough. Kadric sheathed his sword slowly. Send riders to the eastern and southern armies. Tell them Ashfeld's force has been annihilated. Tell them continuing the campaign means facing a duke who just demonstrated he'll accept any casualties necessary to win. Give them 48 hours to withdraw completely from Valamont territory, or we bring our remaining forces to repeat this massacre. Your Grace, in our current state, they don't know that. They just know we destroyed the strongest member of their alliance through night assault that should have been impossible. They'll withdraw because continuing means potentially experiencing the same fate. Fear works. My father was right. He turned toward where the medical units were working on countless wounded, make sure the prisoners are treated properly. Document everything. I want this battle recorded so thoroughly that no kingdom ever again mistakes Valamont for an easy target. He walked through this carnage toward where Seraphina worked among the wounded, her silver cloak now stained beyond recognition. She looked up as he approached, her expression showing exhaustion mixed with relief. "You're alive." Surprisingly, he knelt beside her, his legs suddenly unable to support his weight. "The alliance is broken. We won." "At what cost?" She gestured at the field of wounded and dying surrounding them. "Look at this. Thousands dead, thousands more who will never fight again. A kingdom bled so thoroughly that victory and defeat start looking identical. The cost of survival when survival requires proving you're more dangerous than the danger threatening you." Kadric's voice carried hollow certainty. "We demonstrated that attacking Valamont costs more than anyone is willing to pay. That's all that matters." "No. What matters is whether you can live with what you've become to achieve that demonstration." She reached out, her blood-stained hand cupping his face. "You turned yourself into your father, led a suicide assault that worked through sheer violent will, sacrificed thousands to prove a point about strength. Everything you swore you wouldn't become, you became because you thought it was necessary." "It was necessary. We're alive because of it. Valamont survives because I made choices that prioritized victory over humanity." He leaned into her touch despite the horror of what he was defending. "Marcus wanted to force me into this. He succeeded. And it turns out he was right. The kingdom needed a monster. I became one. We survived.
And now? Her voice cracked slightly. What happens to the man who burned everything to demonstrate strength?
What happens to us when the battle is over and all that's left is the memory of what you sacrificed to win? Before Kaedric could answer, a commotion erupted near the southern edge of the battlefield. Soldiers shouting, weapons being drawn, something moving through the morning fog with enough presence to trigger collective alarm. General Thorn appeared running, his expression showing something beyond tactical concern. Your Grace, you need to see this, now. Kaedric forced himself upright. Kaedric, his body protesting every movement. He followed Thorn through the carnage toward where soldiers had formed a defensive perimeter around something or someone emerging from the fog. As they got closer, the figure became visible, a rider, alone, wearing colors that Kaedric recognized with sickening immediacy. House Valen, Marcus's family crest emblazoned on a banner that should have been buried with the traitor who had worn it. The rider dismounted slowly, removing his helm to reveal features that were hauntingly familiar. Same jaw, same eyes, same presence that commanded attention without demanding it. General Thorn's voice carried quiet dread. Your Grace, this is Lord Garrett Valen, Marcus's younger brother. He claims to have information vital to Valamont's survival. He's requesting immediate audience. Kaedric stared at the ghost of his dead friend wearing someone else's face. Marcus's brother, the family member who had remained mysteriously absent during the entire conspiracy and execution, now appearing in the aftermath of the most brutal battle Valamont had ever fought, carrying information too important to ignore and too suspicious to trust. Garrett Valen met his eyes without flinching, his expression showing something between grief and calculation. When he spoke, his voice carried the same measured cadence that Marcus had used when delivering news designed to manipulate responses. Your Grace, forgive the dramatic timing, but you need to know something about the alliance that just attacked you. Something my brother discovered before his execution. Something he died trying to tell you but couldn't because you were too consumed by rage to listen. He paused, letting tension build. The three armies weren't coordinated by external kingdoms. They were funded and organized by someone inside Valamont. Someone who has been planning your destruction for years. Someone who used Marcus as a scapegoat while they continue operating from inside your own fortress. The words hit like physical blows. Everything Kaedric thought he understood about the invasion and betrayal suddenly fractured into new patterns. Marcus wasn't the architect, just another piece. The real conspiracy was still active, still embedded in Blackthorn Keep, still working toward his destruction while he stood in a field of bodies, believing the threat had been eliminated. Around him, his officers waited for response. Beside him, Seraphina's expression showed dawning horror. Behind him, his army that had just sacrificed thousands to win a battle that might have been designed to weaken them for whatever came next. Garrett Valen waited with the patience of someone delivering checkmate, his presence promising answers that would either save Valamont or destroy it completely. The morning sun climbed higher, illuminating a battlefield where 30,000 men had fought to mutual exhaustion, where victory and defeat blurred into identical devastation, and where Duke Kaedric Raventhorn stood on the edge of understanding that everything he had destroyed himself to achieve might have been exactly what his true enemies wanted all along. The command tent had been erected hastily on ground still warm from the battle's carnage. Inside, Kaedric stood across from Garrett Valen, while General Thorn and Commander Valens flanked the entrance with hands on weapons, ready to kill Marcus's brother at the first sign of treachery. Seraphina had insisted on being present despite the danger, her blood-stained cloak a reminder of how much had already been sacrificed to reach this moment. Garrett stood with the same easy confidence his brother had displayed, that infuriating Valen certainty that suggested they knew something everyone else had missed. But his eyes carried something Marcus's had never shown, genuine grief mixed with fury that seemed directed inward as much as outward. Kedric's voice came out flat and dangerous. Talk, fast. Every second you waste is another second I consider whether executing you beside your brother would have prevented whatever you're about to reveal. Garrett didn't flinch. My brother wasn't the architect of the conspiracy against you. He was a tool. A very effective tool, admittedly, but still just a piece being moved by someone far more patient and strategic. He paused, letting the words settle. Someone who understood that the best way to destroy Duke Cadric Raventhorn wasn't through direct assault, but by turning you into your father, by making you brutal and isolated and paranoid until you destroyed yourself from within. Get to the name. Lady Alara Thornwood, your late mother's cousin, the woman who has served as Blackthorn Keep's chief administrator for the past 15 years. The trusted advisor who manages your household, controls your correspondence, and has access to every secret that passes through this fortress. Garrett's expression hardened. She's been working with a coalition of minor noble houses who believe Valamont would be better served by fractured leadership rather than centralized power. Houses too small to challenge you directly, but collectively strong enough to fund invasions and coordinate conspiracies. The name detonated in Kedric's mind like an explosion. Lady Alara, his mother's cousin, the woman who had comforted him after his father's death, who had helped implement his reforms, who had been present for every decision, every vulnerability, every moment when he had tried to be something better than the tyrant his father had been. She had been there, always. Watching, waiting, collecting information while he trusted her completely because she was family, and family meant something when everything else felt uncertain. The betrayal was so comprehensive it became almost beautiful in its execution. Marcus had been the visible traitor, the obvious target for rage and retribution, but Lady Alara had remained invisible, using Marcus's exposure to eliminate the one person who might have eventually uncovered her role. She had orchestrated his destruction through layers of deception so elegant that even discovering them felt like being outmaneuvered posthumously. Cadric's hands clenched into fists hard enough that his gauntlets creaked. Where is she now? Blackthorn Keep, still managing your household, still processing correspondence, still maintaining the facade of loyal service while coordinating with the minor houses who funded this invasion. Garrett pulled a sealed letter from his cloak. My brother discovered her involvement 3 days before his execution. He tried to tell you. Left messages, sent urgent requests for private audience. But you were too consumed by rage to listen to the man you believed had destroyed you. The words landed like physical blows. Marcus had tried to warn him, had died trying to expose the real conspiracy. And Cadric had been too blinded by betrayal to listen, too committed to the narrative that his oldest friend was the architect rather than another victim. He had executed Marcus while the true enemy continued operating from inside his fortress, using that execution to further isolate him from anyone who might have helped uncover the truth. The realization was poison. Everything he had destroyed himself to achieve had been exactly what Lady Alara wanted. Every brutal decision, every execution, every transformation into his father's worst instincts. All of it had served her strategy of turning him into a tyrant so hated that even his own kingdom would welcome alternative leadership. And he had played the role perfectly.
Seraphina's voice cut through the silence, quiet but carrying weight. Why are you telling us this now? Why not let it play out? Let Cadric destroy himself completely while your family's enemy burns. Because Marcus was my brother. Garrett met her eyes directly. Because whatever else he did, he loved Valamont, served it the only way he understood, and he died believing he had failed completely. He paused, his voice cracking slightly. I won't let his death mean nothing. Won't let Lady Alara's conspiracy succeed because I was too coward to risk bringing you information that might be ignored or disbelieved. General Thorne moved forward, his tactical mind already working through implications. Your Grace, if this is accurate, we have a hostile administrator controlling information flow inside Blackthorn Keep. She knows our force disposition, knows our casualties from this battle, knows exactly how vulnerable we are right now. If the minor houses move while we're weakened, then we deal with it. Cadric's voice came out hollow. The same way we've dealt with everything else, through violence and sacrifice and choices that cost pieces of my soul every time I make them. He turned to Garrett. You have proof? Documentation? Anything beyond your word and a letter that could be forged? Garrett handed over the sealed letter along with a small leather journal. The letter is from Marcus, written the night before his execution, sealed with his personal signet. The journal contains 2 years of observations about Lady Alara's activities, payment records, coded correspondence, meeting notes, everything he gathered while trying to understand why someone was feeding information to your enemies. Cadric broke the seal, recognizing Marcus's handwriting immediately. The letter was brief and devastating in its clarity. It detailed Lady Alara's conspiracy,
explained how Marcus had discovered it while investigating the Mordain coordination, and closed with words that cut deeper than any blade. I know you won't believe this. No, you think I'm lying to save myself. But you'll understand eventually that I was trying to protect you the only way I knew how, even when it made me your enemy. Don't let her win. Don't let my death be meaningless. Be better than your father. Be better than me. The letter crumpled in Caedric's fist. Marcus had known, had tried to warn him, had died with the truth unspoken because Caedric had been too consumed by rage to listen. The weight of that realization threatened to collapse him completely. Everything he thought he understood about betrayal and loyalty and trust had been wrong. Marcus had been trying to save him. Lady Alara had been destroying him, and he had executed the wrong person while the real enemy watched and calculated her next move. The tent fell silent except for distant sounds of the army tending to wounded and securing prisoners. Outside, the sun climbed higher over a battlefield where thousands had died fighting an invasion that had been designed not to conquer Valamont, but to weaken its duke psychologically. Every casualty had served Lady Alara's strategy. Every brutal decision had pushed Caedric further into the isolation she needed to complete his destruction, and he had given her everything she wanted. Serafina moved beside him, her presence grounding despite the chaos spinning through his mind. What do you need? Caedric looked at her, seeing clearly for the first time since Marcus's execution how thoroughly he had been manipulated. Need. What did he need? Revenge? Justice? To burn Lady Alara the way he had burned everyone else who moved against him? The instinct was there, immediate and visceral. But beneath the rage, something else whispered that revenge was exactly what she expected, that violence was the response she had calculated for, that becoming more brutal would only prove she had been right about him all along. For the first time in weeks, Caedric paused before choosing destruction. The hesitation felt foreign, uncomfortable, like a muscle that had atrophied from disuse. His father would have ridden back to Blackthorn Keep and executed Lady Alara along with anyone who had looked at her sideways, would have turned suspicion into purge and made the fortress run red with blood until no conspiracy could possibly survive. That approach had worked for 40 years until it finally killed him. Caedric had sworn to be different, had built a decade of reforms trying to rule through wisdom rather than fear. Then Marcus's betrayal had shattered that foundation, and he had reverted to his father's methods with the desperate conviction of someone who believed brutality was the only language that worked. He had become the monster Marcus claimed Valamont needed, had sacrificed humanity for power, had proven Lady Alara right about everything she had whispered to the minor houses, that Duke Raventhorn was just his father wearing a younger face, and Valamont deserved liberation from tyrannical rule. But standing in this tent with Serafina beside him and Marcus's final letter in his hand, Caedric understood something his father never had, that the moment you stopped calculating alternatives was the moment you became predictable. And predictable rulers were just targets waiting for someone patient enough to exploit their patterns. Lady Alara expected violence, expected rage, expected him to charge back to Blackthorn Keep and execute her in front of the assembled court as proof that challenging him meant death. That response would complete her strategy perfectly, would demonstrate to every noble house that Duke Raventhorn ruled through fear alone, would justify their belief that collective action against tyranny was not just permissible but morally necessary. So he would give her something she hadn't calculated for, restraint backed by exposure rather than violence backed by terror. Caedric looked at General Thorne with eyes that had started calculating again rather than simply reacting. We returned to Blackthorn Keep, slowly, taking time to tend to wounded and secure our supply lines. We send riders ahead announcing our victory and imminent return. We make no mention of Lady Alara or conspiracies or anything that might warn her we know. Your Grace, if she realizes we've discovered her role, then she runs or accelerates her plans. Either way, we flush her into action rather than letting her continue operating from shadow. Caedric's voice carried the cold precision that had been absent since Marcus's death. When we arrive, we convene a public assembly. Every noble house, every administrator, every person with authority in Valamont. We present Marcus's evidence. We expose the conspiracy in exhaustive detail. We give Lady Alara opportunity to defend herself in front of the entire kingdom. That's not justice. Commander Valen's voice carried confusion. That's just theater that delays inevitable execution. No. That's how you destroy a conspiracy built on whispers and hidden coordination.
Kedrick's eyes held something that hadn't been there for weeks, calculation that extended beyond immediate violence. You expose it so completely that everyone involved understands they've been caught. You give them opportunity to confess and cooperate. You make the cost of continued resistance higher than the cost of surrender, and you demonstrate to the kingdom that their duke values truth over vengeance. Serafina studied him carefully. This is different. You're different. What changed? Everything. Nothing. Kedrick looked at Marcus's letter again, the words blurring slightly. I've spent weeks becoming what everyone claimed I was. Brutal, isolated, willing to sacrifice anything for power. And it worked tactically. We won the battle, destroyed the invasion, proved that Valamont couldn't be conquered through force. He paused, forcing himself to articulate something he barely understood. But Marcus died trying to protect me, and I was too consumed by my father's doctrine to listen. That changes everything. Because if I keep ruling the way I have been, I prove Lady Alara right. Prove that I'm just another tyrant who needs to be removed for the kingdom's good. And maybe she's right. Maybe that's exactly what I've become. The admission hung in the air like confession and self-condemnation combined. Around him, his officers absorbed this new version of their duke, one who questioned rather than commanded, who analyzed rather than simply reacted, who might be finding his way back to the man he had tried to be before betrayal convinced him that humanity was weakness. Garrett Vallon broke the silence with quiet intensity. My brother believed you could be better than your father. Believed it enough to die with that hope unspoken. Don't waste his faith. Kedrick met his eyes, seeing Marcus in the features and mannerisms. Your brother manipulated me for 3 years, fed information to enemies, orchestrated situations designed to force brutal responses. Whatever his final intentions, his methods nearly destroyed everything I built. And yet he also tried to warn you about the real threat. Died believing he had failed but hoping you would eventually understand. Garrett's voice carried the complicated grief of someone mourning a brother who had been both hero and villain simultaneously. You can hate him for what he did, but don't dishonor his final act by ignoring what he died trying to tell you. The words settled with uncomfortable weight. Kedrick wanted to reject them, to maintain the narrative that Marcus was simply a traitor who deserved execution, but the letter made that impossible. The evidence forced acknowledgement that people were more complicated than the roles assigned to them, that someone could betray and protect simultaneously, that even enemies could die trying to serve the things they believed mattered. It was exhausting, infuriating, and somehow necessary for whatever came next. The army began its march back to Blackthorn Keep the following day, moving slowly enough that wounded could be transported without additional casualties. Kedrick rode at the front beside Serafina, his mind working through the confrontation ahead with Lady Alara. Behind them, 15,000 survivors carried the weight of victory purchased through catastrophic sacrifice. Around them, the landscape showed signs of spring arriving despite winter's grip, snow melting in patches that revealed ground ready to accept new growth. Serafina rode in silence for hours before finally speaking. You're planning to give her a trial, public accountability, everything your father never did. Yes, he would have just executed her, made it brutal and public and terrifying enough that no one would ever consider conspiracy again. I know, so why aren't you? The question deserved honest answer even when honest answers revealed weakness. Because my father's method worked until it killed him. Because ruling through fear alone means dying to betrayal. You never see coming. Because Marcus died trying to tell me something important, and I was too committed to being my father's son to listen. He paused, watching the road ahead disappear into mountain passes. Because maybe Valamont deserves a duke who tries to be something other than a monster. Even after everything that's happened proved monsters survive longer than reformers. That's not weakness. Feels like it. Feels like I'm abandoning the doctrine that just won us an impossible battle. Feels like I'm risking everything we fought for by choosing mercy over violence. His hands tightened on the reins. But I've spent weeks watching myself become everything I swore I wouldn't be. Executing friends, sacrificing thousands, ruling through systematic brutality that made my father look restrained. And it worked. We survived. We won. But I look at what I became to achieve that victory, and I barely recognize myself. Serafina's voice carried quiet certainty. That's called growth. Recognizing that survival isn't the same as living, that power without humanity is just noise.
That sometimes the strongest thing you can do is choose differently, even when violence would be easier. The word should have brought comfort. Instead, Cedric felt only the crushing uncertainty of someone who had stopped trusting his own judgment. Every instinct screamed that exposing Lady Alara publicly was strategic stupidity. That swift execution would send clearer messages. That restraint would be interpreted as weakness by people waiting for any sign that Duke Raventhorn had lost his edge. His father's voice whispered in memory that mercy was the first crack through which enemies entered. But his father was dead, murdered by someone close enough to poison his food, killed by the very fear he had cultivated so systematically. And Cedric had spent weeks following that same path toward the same inevitable outcome. Isolation so complete that death became the only escape from constant paranoia. There had to be another way. Had to be some approach that balanced strength with wisdom, fear with respect, power with connection. Marcus had tried to show him that through manipulation and orchestrated crisis. Lady Alara had tried to destroy him by pushing him toward his father's worst instincts. Both had been wrong about who he could be. Now he needed to prove it to himself before he could demonstrate it to anyone else. Blackthorn. Keep appeared on the 4th day of marching, the fortress rising from mountain rock like something carved by ancient forces rather than human hands. Citizens lined the streets cheering victory over the Alliance, celebrating their duke's return from battle that should have destroyed them. They saw triumph. They didn't see the casualties, didn't understand the cost, didn't recognize that their duke had sacrificed pieces of himself that might never regenerate. But they would learn, because what happened next would either redeem him or prove that some transformations were permanent, regardless of regret. Lady Alara waited in the great hall when they arrived, her expression showing appropriate concern mixed with relief. She had organized welcome ceremonies, prepared reports on fortress management during his absence, and maintained every appearance of loyal service. Looking at her, Cedric felt rage so intense it bordered on ecstasy. This woman had orchestrated everything, had used his trust against him, had manipulated him into becoming a monster while maintaining perfect facade of family loyalty. Killing her would be so easy, so satisfying, so exactly what she expected. He smiled instead. Lady Alara, thank you for maintaining order during our absence. Sit. Your service to Blackthorn Keep continues to exceed all reasonable expectations. She curtsied with practiced grace. Your Grace, Valamont rejoices at your victory. The alliance has been broken. Our enemies scattered. You have demonstrated yet again why this kingdom remains unconquerable under Raventhorn rule. Indeed. Cedric moved past her toward the high table, his movements casual despite the tension coiling through his body. I'm convening a full assembly tomorrow morning, every noble house, every administrator, everyone with authority in Valamont. We have matters of governance to address now that external threats have been eliminated. Something flickered in Lady Alara's expression, too fast to identify, but present nonetheless. Of course, Your Grace, I'll ensure appropriate notifications are sent immediately. Excellent. Also, I'm granting you formal recognition for your years of service, a public commendation during the assembly. Valamont should know how thoroughly you've served this house. Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. You honor me, Your Grace. Not yet, but tomorrow will ensure everyone understands exactly how you've served the Raventhorn name. He left her standing in the great hall, her expression showing the first cracks in composure. She knew, or suspected, or recognized that something had shifted in ways she hadn't calculated for. Either way, she now had hours to decide whether to run or accelerate her plans, or simply maintain innocence and hope her conspiracy remained undiscovered. Cedric was counting on the latter, because people who had operated in shadow for years rarely abandoned strategy for panic. They doubled down, committed to their cover, believed their own performances right up until evidence made denial impossible. That night, Cedric stood in his study reviewing Marcus's journal, while Serafina organized the documentation that would be presented at tomorrow's assembly. The evidence was comprehensive. 2 years of observations about Lady Alara, meeting with representatives from minor noble houses. Financial records showing gold flowing through intermediaries to fund Mordane's invasion. Coded correspondence that became transparent once you understood the pattern. Everything needed to prove conspiracy so thoroughly that even Lady Alara's allies would abandon her rather than be caught in the exposure. Serafina looked up from her work, her expression thoughtful. You're doing this publicly because you want everyone to see you choose justice over revenge.
Want to demonstrate that Duke Raventhorn can be something other than his father's echo. Partially. Also because public exposure destroys conspiracies more effectively than executions. Kill Lady Alara quietly, and the minor houses wonder what she might have revealed. Kill her publicly after exposing everything, and they understand that continued resistance means being the next person displayed for collective judgment. He paused, staring at Marcus's handwriting. And because Marcus died trying to give me this information, the least I can do is use it the way he intended rather than just adding another corpse to the collection. You miss him. The observation landed with uncomfortable accuracy. Kedrick wanted to deny it, wanted to maintain that Marcus was just a traitor who received appropriate punishment. But standing there with his friend's journal documenting years of loyal service, even while betraying him, he couldn't sustain the narrative. Marcus had been complicated, had betrayed and protected simultaneously, had died trying to warn him about the real threat, even knowing Kedrick wouldn't believe him. Yes, I miss him. Miss having someone who questioned my decisions without hidden agendas. Miss the friendship that turned out to be performance, but felt real anyway. He set down the journal carefully, which makes me either incredibly naive or dangerously sentimental, both qualities likely to get me killed eventually, or human. Serafina moved beside him, her hand finding his. You spent weeks trying to become something beyond human, pure will and violence and calculated brutality. It didn't work. You won the battle, but lost yourself in the process. She paused, her voice dropping. Maybe the point isn't to be invulnerable. Maybe it's to be strong enough to stay human even when humanity costs everything. The words settled like truth he wasn't ready to accept but couldn't deny. His father had made himself invulnerable through systematic isolation and died alone, poisoned by someone he never suspected. Kedrick had tried to be better and nearly lost everything to betrayal. Now he was attempting something neither had managed, ruling with enough humanity to inspire loyalty while maintaining enough strength to survive betrayal. The balance seemed impossible, the variables too complicated, the risks catastrophic. But the alternative was becoming his father completely, and that outcome had already proven fatal. Dawn arrived cold and clear, the kind of morning that felt significant regardless of what actually happened. The great hall filled early, every noble house sending representatives, every administrator and officer crowding into available space. They came expecting celebration of military victory, awards and recognition, and the pageantry that followed successful campaigns. Instead, they got silence as Duke Kedrick Raventhorn entered with documents under his arm and an expression that promised something far more serious than ceremony. Lady Alara stood near the front, her composure perfect, her appearance suggesting someone prepared for public commendation. Beside her, several representatives from minor noble houses shifted nervously, some instinct warning them that something fundamental had shifted. Kedrick took his position at the high table, Serafina standing beside him in visible support, rather than retiring to appropriate distance. General Thorne and Commander Valens flanked the hall's entrance. Garrett Valens stood near the back, his presence unremarked but significant for anyone who understood what his attendance implied. The Duke's voice carried across the assembled nobility with absolute clarity. Valamont has survived external invasion through sacrifice and commitment that will be remembered for generations. Our victory came at catastrophic cost, but demonstrated that this kingdom cannot be conquered through superior numbers or coordinated assault. For this, you have my gratitude and respect. Polite applause followed, appropriate responses to expected sentiment. Then Kedrick raised his hand and the hall fell silent immediately. But external threats are manageable compared to internal corruption. Enemies on the battlefield identify themselves through banners and formations. Enemies inside the fortress wear familiar faces and maintain perfect loyalty until the moment they don't. He paused, letting tension build. Which brings us to matters of governance and accountability that require immediate address. He placed Marcus's journal on the table with deliberate care. The sound of leather hitting wood echoed through absolute silence. This journal was compiled by Marcus Valen over 2 years of investigation into why Valamont's enemies seem to always know our strategies, our weaknesses, our internal divisions, why every reform I attempted faced coordinated resistance, why external threats always materialized at moments of maximum internal vulnerability. He opened to marked pages. What he discovered was a conspiracy funded by minor noble houses and coordinated by someone with complete access to this fortress's operations. Someone trusted implicitly. Someone who used that trust to systematically undermine my rule while maintaining perfect facade of family loyalty. Lady Alara's composure cracked visibly. Your Grace, I don't understand. You understand perfectly. Kedrick's voice cut like steel. You've coordinated with houses Pemberton, Blackwood, Ashmont, and 6 others too minor to rate formal recognition. You facilitated payment to House Mordain to fund their invasion. You fed intelligence about our force disposition and strategic planning to the alliance that just attacked us. You orchestrated situations designed to push me toward brutal responses that would justify collective action against tyrannical rule. The hall erupted in chaos, nobles shouting denials or accusations, Lady Alara attempting to speak over the noise, representatives from the named houses trying to exit before guards blocked entrances. The careful order that governed aristocratic society disintegrated into panic as conspiracy was exposed with documentation too detailed to dismiss as fabrication. Kaedric waited for the noise to peak before speaking again, his voice somehow cutting through chaos without shouting. The evidence is comprehensive. Financial records, coded correspondence, meeting notes. Everything needed to prove systematic conspiracy spanning multiple years. He looked directly at Lady Alara. You have opportunity to respond, to present alternative explanations, to defend yourself before the entire kingdom you claim to serve. What do you say? Lady Alara's mask shattered completely. Her expression transformed from composed administrator into something calculating and cold. What do I say? That you're right. That every word is accurate. That I spent 15 years watching you try to reform a kingdom that functions through strength alone. Watching you weaken Valamont with mercy and diplomacy and the naive belief that power and compassion could coexist. Her voice rose with conviction. Your father understood reality. Understood that fear maintains order. That brutality prevents challenges. That rulers who try to be loved end up dead. I tried to force you to learn those lessons. Tried to push you into becoming the Duke Valamont actually needed rather than the reformer you wanted to be. So you funded invasions that killed thousands, orchestrated betrayals that destroyed friendships, manipulated me into becoming a monster because you thought monsters ruled more effectively than men. Yes, and I was right. You won the battle against Ashfeld because you finally stopped trying to be better than your father and embraced the brutality that actually works. You destroyed Mordain because you unleashed violence without restraint. Everything you accomplished came from abandoning reform and becoming what I knew you needed to be. Lady Alara's expression held strange triumph despite her exposure. I didn't destroy you. I refined you, turned you into the ruler Valamont deserves. The hall fell absolutely silent. Every person present absorbed the implications of what was being said, that the conspiracy hadn't been designed to destroy Duke Raventhorn, but to transform him. That Lady Alara had orchestrated years of crisis specifically to force him into his father's methods. That everything he had suffered had been calculated manipulation by someone who believed she was serving Valamont's best interests by making its duke into a monster. It was insane, brilliant, comprehensively evil, dressed as patriotic service. Kaedric studied her with something approaching clinical detachment. You're right about one thing. Brutality works tactically. Fear prevents immediate challenges. Violence delivered without hesitation destroys enemies efficiently. He paused, his voice dropping. But my father ruled through fear for 40 years and died poisoned by someone close enough to reach his food. His methods worked until they killed him. And you've spent 15 years pushing me toward the same fate because you couldn't imagine any alternative. There is no alternative. Lady Alara's certainty remained absolute despite her situation. Rulers who show weakness get conquered. Leaders who prioritize compassion get betrayed. You learned that through Marcus, through Mordain, through every crisis I orchestrated to teach you that survival requires sacrifice of everything that makes you human. Perhaps. Or perhaps the lesson is that people like you will always exist, will always believe that brutality is the only viable strategy, will always push toward outcomes that confirm your worldview regardless of alternatives. Kaedric's voice carried cold finality. The question isn't whether fear works. It's whether I'm willing to become my father to achieve his kind of power. And after weeks of trying that approach, after transforming into everything I swore I wouldn't be, I've discovered something you never understood.
What?
That surviving isn't the same as living. That power without humanity is just noise. That I'd rather risk death trying to rule with wisdom than guarantee survival by ruling with systematic terror. He gestured to the guards.
Lady Alara Thornwood, you stand convicted by your own confession of treason, conspiracy with foreign powers, and orchestrating attacks that killed thousands of Valamont citizens. You will be held pending formal sentencing. The minor houses named in this conspiracy will surrender assets and authority pending investigation. Anyone who cooperates fully will be treated with appropriate mercy. Anyone who continues resistance will discover that mercy has limits. The guards moved forward. Lady Alara didn't resist, her expression showing strange satisfaction despite capture. You'll understand eventually, when the next crisis comes. When external threats or internal challenges force you to choose between principles and survival, you'll become what I tried to make you, and you'll realize I was right all along. Maybe. Kedrick watched her being led away, feeling nothing except exhausted recognition that some people could never be convinced they were wrong. Or maybe I'll prove that another way exists, that rulers can be strong without being monstrous, that Valamont can survive through wisdom rather than just fear. Either way, I'm done letting other people define what kind of duke I need to be. The assembly dissolved into chaos as noble houses scrambled to distance themselves from exposed conspiracy. Representatives from the minor houses were detained for questioning. Administrators began the complex process of untangling years of coordinated corruption. And throughout it all, Kedrick stood at the high table feeling something he hadn't experienced in months. The possibility that he might survive without completely losing himself in the process. Serafina found him hours later in his study, staring at Marcus's journal with expression mixing grief and complicated acceptance. She didn't speak immediately, just sat beside him in comfortable silence while evening shadows filled the room. Finally, she asked the question that mattered. What happens now? After exposure and trials and whatever justice looks like for people who believe they were serving Valamont by destroying its duke, now we rebuild. Again. Differently this time. Kedrick set down the journal. I've spent a decade trying to reform through kindness and tolerance. Spent weeks trying to rule through fear and brutality. Both approaches nearly destroyed everything, so maybe the answer is somewhere between. Strong enough to survive betrayal, but human enough to inspire loyalty beyond fear. That's a narrow path. Everything worthwhile usually is. He looked at her directly, seeing clearly what months of crisis had obscured. You stayed, despite having every reason to run, despite watching me become something monstrous, despite knowing that proximity to me makes you a target. Why? Because someone needed to remember who you were before fear and betrayal convinced you that monsters survived better than men. Serafina's voice carried quiet certainty. Because walking away would have meant letting Marcus and Lady Alara and everyone else who pushed you toward brutality win completely. Because love means staying even when staying is stupid and dangerous and likely to end badly. Love. The word felt foreign. Kedrick had spent months confusing possession with affection, obsession with connection, the need to protect with actual care. Lady Alara had orchestrated Serafina's abduction specifically to trigger his worst instincts. Marcus had questioned his feelings as manipulation waiting to be exploited. Everyone had treated love as weakness rather than recognizing it as the thing that might prevent him from becoming his father completely. But Serafina had stayed, through executions and battles and transformation into brutality, had remained beside him not because she was trapped, but because she chose to believe he could be more than what circumstances forced him to become. That was either the greatest demonstration of faith or the most catastrophic miscalculation of character in history. Time would determine which. I don't know if I can be what you deserve. The admission felt like confession. I'm damaged in ways that might never heal. Shaped by my father's brutality and Marcus's betrayal and Lady Alara's manipulation into something that barely recognizes itself. The Duke you want me to be might not exist anymore. Then we figure out who you actually are instead of mourning who you wish you'd remained. She took his hand, her grip firm, despite the bloodstains still visible on her fingers from tending wounded. You're not your father. You're not the monster Marcus tried to create or the tyrant Lady Alara wanted to forge. You're whoever you decide to be from this moment forward. That's all anyone gets. The choice to be better or worse based on what we do next rather than what was done to us. The words settled with uncomfortable accuracy. Kedrick had spent months being reactive, responding to crises, making decisions based on immediate threats rather than long-term vision. He had let other people define his choices through their actions against him. had transformed into his father not because it was necessary, but because it was easier than imagining alternatives when betrayal made trust impossible. But that was just surrender disguised as strength, just allowing circumstances to dictate outcomes rather than choosing deliberately despite complications. His father had ruled one way and died for it. Cedric had tried another approach and nearly lost everything. Now he had opportunity to find a third path that balanced strength with wisdom,
Fear with respect, power with humanity.
it would be harder. Would require constant vigilance against instincts that whispered brutality was simpler than complexity. Would mean accepting vulnerability as cost of connection rather than weakness to be eliminated. Would force him to become someone neither his father, nor Marcus, nor Lady Alara had imagined possible. But the alternative was becoming predictable. And predictable rulers were just targets waiting for someone patient enough to exploit their patterns. Cedric stood slowly, moving to the window that overlooked Valamont spread below the fortress. The kingdom looked peaceful in evening light, citizens going about lives that depended on decisions made in this room. They deserved better than a duke who ruled through systematic terror. Deserved someone who valued their lives beyond tactical calculations. Deserved leadership that inspired something other than fear. Whether he could become that person remained uncertain, but he could try, could choose differently, could honor Marcus's final sacrifice by proving that wisdom and strength weren't mutually exclusive, could demonstrate to Lady Alara that her cynical worldview didn't define the only path toward survival. It would take years, would require rebuilding trust that had been shattered thoroughly, would mean accepting that some people would never forgive or forget what he had become during the darkest weeks. But redemption wasn't about others' acceptance. It was about making choices that aligned with who you wanted to be rather than who circumstances tried to force you into becoming. Serafina joined him at the window, her presence grounding. Tomorrow we start trials for the minor houses. Next week we begin implementing reforms that balance security with individual rights. Next month we rebuild alliances with kingdoms that watched us destroy Mordain and wondered if we'd become existential threat. Her voice carried exhaustion mixed with determination. It's going to be brutal. People will challenge every decision. Some will see mercy as weakness. Others will interpret strength as tyranny. There's no perfect path forward. No. But there's a path that doesn't require me becoming my father completely. That preserves some connection to the man who believed reform was possible. That honors Marcus's faith and your stubborn refusal to abandon hope. He paused, allowing himself to articulate the truth he had been avoiding. That gives me reason to survive beyond just maintaining power. That makes the struggle mean something past tactical victory. That's called living, as opposed to just surviving. She leaned against him slightly, the simple physical contact more powerful than dramatic declarations. It's harder, requires vulnerability, means accepting that you might fail despite best intentions. But it's the only way forward that doesn't end with you poisoned by someone close because you trusted no one and inspired nothing except fear. The observation landed with uncomfortable accuracy. His father had died exactly that way, murdered by the very isolation he had cultivated. Cedric had been walking the same path with determined conviction that it was the only route toward security. Lady Alara had pushed him further down that road, believing she was serving Valamont's interests. Marcus had tried to stop him through manipulation that made things worse. Now Serafina was offering a different option. Choose deliberately rather than simply reacting. Build consciously rather than just defending. Create something worth protecting rather than just maintaining power for its own sake. It required faith he didn't possess and trust he couldn't afford, and vulnerability that terrified him more than any battlefield. But the alternative was becoming predictable. And predictable rulers were just targets waiting to be eliminated by the next conspiracy. Over the following months, Valamont transformed in ways that would have been impossible without catastrophic crisis, forcing recognition that old methods no longer worked. Lady Alara stood trial publicly, her conspiracy exposed in exhaustive detail that left no doubt about her guilt or the sophistication of her manipulation. The minor houses who had funded her activities faced asset seizures and political marginalization that destroyed their influence without requiring executions. Representatives from larger kingdoms who had participated in the alliance against Valamon found themselves negotiating, with a duke who had demonstrated both capacity for absolute brutality and willingness to choose restraint when appropriate. The balance was precarious. Some nobles interpreted mercy as weakness and attempted to exploit it until swift responses reminded them that restraint didn't mean vulnerability.
Other houses recognized the shift and adjusted their strategies accordingly, cooperating with reforms that distributed power more equitably while maintaining strong central authority. Citizens watched their duke transform from feared tyrant back into something more complicated, a leader who valued their lives beyond tactical calculations, but remained capable of defending them with overwhelming force when necessary. It wasn't perfect, wasn't the clean redemption that stories promised, but it was real in ways that absolute brutality or naive compassion could never achieve. Kadric remained dangerous, remained capable of violence that terrified enemies, but that capacity existed alongside wisdom that prevented violence from being the default response to every challenge. He had learned through devastating costs that power without humanity was just noise, that ruling through fear alone guaranteed eventual death by betrayal, that the strongest thing he could do was choose deliberately rather than simply reacting to circumstances. Marcus's memory haunted him. The knowledge that his oldest friend had died trying to warn him about the real threat. That final betrayal hadn't been betrayal at all, but desperate attempt to protect him even knowing Kaedric wouldn't believe. He had Marcus's journal transcribed and placed in Blackthorn Keep's archives as a reminder that people were more complicated than the roles assigned to them, that someone could betray and serve simultaneously. That judgment delivered in rage rarely captured complete truth. Lady Alara was executed eventually, her sentence carried out with clinical efficiency rather than theatrical brutality. She died maintaining that she had served Valamont's interests by forcing its duke to become strong enough to survive. Whether she was right remained permanently debatable. Kaedric chose to believe she was wrong because accepting her worldview meant surrendering to the idea that brutality was the only viable path. But doubt remained, would always remain. That was the cost of choosing wisdom over certainty. Seraphina stayed, not as captive or trophy or symbol of conquest, but as partner who refused to let him drift back into isolation. They married eventually, the ceremony small and deliberately understated because grand declarations felt inappropriate after everything that had happened. She continued working with medical services and civic improvements, maintaining identity beyond her relationship to power. He continued ruling with the complicated balance of strength and restraint that prevented him from becoming his father while acknowledging that some of his father's instincts had been correct. They fought, often. She challenged his decisions when brutality seemed easier than complexity. He pushed back when compassion threatened security. But the fighting came from genuine disagreement rather than manipulation or power games. It was exhausting and frustrating and somehow necessary for preventing him from drifting toward either extreme. Years passed. Valamont stabilized into something more sustainable than fear-based rule, but stronger than naive reform. Kaedric's reputation evolved from tyrant to something more nuanced. A duke who had been broken and remade, who understood both sides of the brutality versus wisdom debate from experience rather than theory, who could be terrifying when necessary, but chose alternatives when possible. He never stopped missing Marcus. Never stopped wondering what might have been different if he had listened before rage demanded execution. The guilt was permanent, but it coexisted with acceptance that some mistakes couldn't be undone, only learned from. He established programs supporting soldiers and their families, remembering the thousands who had died at Ashfeld, proving that brutality won battles, but wisdom prevented unnecessary wars. He reformed governance structures that had concentrated too much power in single positions, acknowledging that his father's paranoid isolation had been symptom rather than solution. It wasn't redemption, wasn't forgiveness or absolution or any clean resolution to complicated trauma. It was simply choosing to be better tomorrow than he had been yesterday. Some days he succeeded. Other days he reverted to his father's instincts and required Seraphina or his advisors to pull him back from edges he approached too readily. But the trajectory was clear. Away from the monster Lady Alara had tried to create, towards something more complex and human and ultimately more dangerous because unpredictability served him better than consistent brutality ever had. Standing in the Great Hall years later, watching his kingdom function with the complicated efficiency of balanced governance, Kaedric understood something fundamental about power and survival. His father had ruled through fear and died alone. Kaedric had tried reform and nearly lost everything to betrayal. The synthesis was accepting that neither extreme worked sustainably, that strength required wisdom, that wisdom required strength, that the only way forward was choosing deliberately in every situation rather than defaulting to patterns that felt safe. but eventually became predictable. He wasn't the duke his father had been, wasn't the reformer he had tried to become, wasn't the tyrant Marcus and Lady Alara had tried to forge. He was something harder to categorize. A ruler who had been broken by betrayal and remade through conscious choice, who understood darkness from experience but refused to let darkness define him, who valued survival but recognized that survival without purpose was just extended dying. Serafina found him in the Great Hall, her approach marked by familiar footsteps that no longer triggered defensive instincts. She stood beside him, looking at the same space where so much had happened, councils and executions and exposures and the slow rebuilding of something worth protecting. You're brooding again, remembering. There's a difference, he gestured at the hall. My father stood here planning campaigns built on fear. I stood here trying to be different and nearly destroyed everything. Marcus died trying to warn me. Lady Alara tried to remake me. And somehow we survived all of it into something neither of them imagined possible. That's called growth. Learning from catastrophic mistakes and choosing differently even when old patterns feel safer. She took his hand, the simple contact grounding as always. You're not perfect. Still make decisions I disagree with. Still default to brutality when patience would work better. But you try, and trying matters more than success when the goal is becoming better rather than just surviving. The words settled with familiar accuracy. She was right. Had been right about most things throughout their complicated journey. He had survived by becoming a monster. Had learned to live by choosing humanity despite the risks. The balance remained precarious. Would always remain precarious. But that was simply the reality of power exercised with wisdom rather than just force. They stood together in the great hall while evening light faded and torches were lit, and Blackthorn Keep transitioned from day to night with mechanical efficiency that marked centuries of Raventhorn rule. The fortress would outlast him, would stand through whatever came next, would shelter future generations of leaders who would face their own crises and betrayals and choices between brutality and wisdom. He hoped they would choose better than he had, learn from his mistakes without needing to experience the same devastating costs. Find balance earlier. Prevent the transformations that had nearly destroyed him completely. But hope was just possibility shaped by intention. Action determined outcome. And the only action that mattered was the next choice made deliberately rather than reactively. The next decision that valued wisdom over expedience. The next moment when strength could be exercised through restraint rather than violence. That was leadership, not perfect, not clean, not guaranteed to succeed, just choosing to be better than circumstances tried to force you to become. Just refusing to let darkness define you even when darkness surrounded everything. Just surviving with enough humanity intact that survival felt like living rather than just extended dying. Duke Cadric Raventhorn stood in his father's hall, his wife beside him, his kingdom functioning with complicated efficiency around him, and understood finally what true strength required. Not invulnerability, not isolation, not systematic brutality or naive compassion, just the courage to remain human when becoming a monster would be simpler. Just the wisdom to choose deliberately when reacting would be faster. Just the faith that balance was possible even when every instinct and experience suggested otherwise. It was enough. Not everything he wanted, not the clean redemption stories promised, but enough to build on, enough to protect, enough to justify the sacrifices that had brought him to this moment. Enough to call living rather than just surviving. And in the great hall where his father had ruled through fear and died alone, where he had executed friends and become a monster and learned finally that another way existed, Duke Cadric Raventhorn chose to believe that tomorrow could be better than today, if he made it so through deliberate action rather than just hoping circumstances improved. That was all anyone could do. All anyone ever had. The choice to be better or worse based on actions taken rather than trauma endured. He chose better. Not perfectly. Not consistently. But deliberately. And that deliberate choice, repeated daily, despite complications and setbacks, and the permanent scars of what he had become in darkness, made all the difference between ruling and merely surviving, between power and noise, between the monster and the man, between his father's fate and the future he was building one difficult choice at a time. The choice was made. The path was clear. The journey continued. And somewhere in the darkness, Marcus Valen's memory rested with the satisfaction of someone who had died believing his friend could be better than circumstances demanded, and had been proven right through costs neither of them could have imagined. The end was also a beginning. The destruction was also foundation. The monster was also a man. And in Valamont, Duke Cadric Ravensthorn ruled with wisdom earned through devastating cost. Loved by someone who chose to stay, feared by enemies who understood that restraint didn't mean weakness, and respected finally by a kingdom that recognized strength came in many forms. The story ended. The life continued, and that was enough.